Chapter 329. Li Yunxin was stunned by his laughter. When he was first brought into Red Flower City by the Lord Dongting, he heard the demon talk about the two sages, the love and hatred between the Sword Saint and the calligrapher, and the grudges between the Lord Dongting and the Sword Saint. Thus, he knew that his mother was a relative of the calligrapher and the Sword Saint in the secular world a long time ago, and he could be said to be the only remaining descendant of the two sages. He originally thought that the two sages were men. Whether it was in his previous era or the current era, the male always had a more dominant position. But later, when he found out that the Sword Saint was a woman, he was not very surprised. After all, it was cultivation. When humans cultivated Tao, their Tao would be profound. Thus, they would obtain great power that surpassed the physical body. In this aspect, the biological difference between men and women could be ignored. At that time, the Lord Dongting did not mention the art saint, and Li Yunxin was not in a hurry to ask. Because in his opinion, since the incident happened 1,000 years ago and was subconsciously erased in the following 1,000 years, it must be a very deep secret. Since that was the case, it would take a lot of effort to find out the truth. But he did not expect that this matter would be revealed by Yang Jianzi at such a moment when he was caught off guard. The art saint was a woman. Li Yunxin suddenly realized that he should have known about this long ago. What kind of person would make a painting called Wu Song Angrily Beating Kitty Cat? And along the river during the Qingming festival, one of the 8 treasures ancient scrolls that he had recently obtained. In fact, when he first heard this name, he felt that something was wrong. When Kun Wuzi gave him the painting and he looked at it again, he was immediately convinced that it was the authentic work of the art saint. Because in this world, no one would, on a palm-sized piece of paper, 2 small matchstick figures were drawn with childish and funny strokes. One of the figures was pressing on the other, and from the posture they were doing something indescribable. And in the blank space there were 4 simplified characters, Qingming, and river diagram. Afraid that people would not be able to distinguish between the Qingming and the river diagram, they had specially marked them with arrows. There was also Evil King and the 7 gourd masters. She left many strange things in this world. If a man had done these things, Li Yunxin would only think that he was a crazy guy. It was very interesting. But now that he knew that it was a woman who did this, the shadow in his mind suddenly became clear. In fact, it should have been clear a long time ago. However, due to his own reasons, the answer to this question, or rather a possible guess, had always been suppressed in the depths of his mind. Now that the layers of veil covering it had been removed by Yang Jianzi, a vivid figure suddenly leaped out of his mind. That person was so vivid that Li Yunxin could almost see her face, hear her voice, and even see the sly smile on her face after she did something ridiculous to the people of this world. In this world, she had left too many things that only people like Li Yunxin could understand and experience. He walked in the world that she had woven and carved, like a traveler walking on a stage where the music had come to an end. Among the wild weeds and the setting sun, he could still see the past. However, for Li Yunxin, Li Yunxin suddenly retreated 50 feet away straight into the clouds. The clouds wrapped around him like water and also covered his expression. Yang Jianzi was still laughing a moment ago, but in the next moment, seeing Li Yunxin suddenly do such a thing, his laughter stopped abruptly. He frowned slightly. "What is Dragon King doing?" "I'm not going." Li Yunxin's voice came from the clouds. No emotion could be heard and his tone was short and concise. Yang Jianzi blinked his eyes in confusion. "Dragon King means, not going to the Red Ridge?" "I'm not going," Li Yunxin immediately answered him in a resolute tone. Yang Jianzi was stunned and fell silent for a while. Then he said something that he didn't know why he would say, "But Dragon King promised me." "Doesn't Dragon King want to know what happened 1,000 years ago?" Li Yunxin also fell silent for a while. "You've been operating in the Red Ridge for so long. How do I know that you're not using what happened 1,000 years ago as bait to tempt me to go? Do I look that stupid to you?" Yang Jianzi was so angry that he almost laughed. "What does Dragon King mean? Didn't I ask you before? I asked you if you're not afraid that my Red Ridge is a trap. What did Dragon King say?" "He said that it's because of personal reasons, so..." But he stopped here. His tone slowly softened. "The personal reason that Dragon King said is because of the art saint?" But Li Yunxin didn't answer him. He only snorted and said, "I'm not stupid. I won't be fooled." After saying this, his voice suddenly went far away. He actually escaped into the clouds. Yang Jianzi only realized after a breath. Li Yunxin had taken Fu Liangzi and Kun Wuzi away. He could accept the fact that those two guys were taken away. But what he couldn't accept was that he felt like he had been fooled. It was like two kids making a promise. Originally they were talking happily, but suddenly one of the kids changed his expression, turned around and ran away. Now he felt like he had become that kid. This hateful Li Yunxin was fooling him in this way. And just a quarter of an hour ago he even thought that Li Yunxin was a formidable person. Therefore he was also driven by an indescribable emotion and rushed into the clouds, chasing after Li Yunxin. A quarter of an hour later Yang Jianzi realized that he was really chasing after Li Yunxin. That Li Yunxin actually showed his real body in the clouds. This cloud looked small on the ground, but it was huge in the sky. However, even such a large cloud for Qi Wen, who had revealed her true form, was only a shallow pond. With a single leap, it was about to break through the clouds and appear in the sunset. But after all, the wind follows the tiger and the clouds follow the dragon. Before Qi Wen showed his true form, this cloud of mist was floating freely in the air. But now that Dragon Sun showed his true form, this cloud of mist was immediately wrapped up by him, becoming a part of the dragon that was hundreds of meters tall. Then lightning began to appear in the cloud. On the ground they looked as thin as a hair. But in the cloud, each of them was as thick as Yang Jianzi's body. As a result, the Sword Palace Master was shocked. His spirit just now was mostly gone in an instant. What was wrong with Li Yunxin? How could she make such a ruckus? Was he planning to have a fierce fight with me? Chapter 330. As he thought this, he slowed down. It wasn't entirely out of fear. It was out of an instinctive caution. Li Yunxin wasn't Na Fu Liangzi. He had already learned some information about Na Fu Liangzi from Xiao Yaozi. He knew that although that person wasn't stupid, he wasn't very shrewd either. He had a plan in mind and was prepared here. Thus, he could act as he pleased like he did with Li Yunxin earlier and didn't need to fear anything. Although they were both in the true realm, how could Li Yunxin be compared to some Fu Liangzi? Putting aside all the unbelievable things he had done earlier, in just this short amount of time, he had already made Yang Jianzi unable to see through him. This person's actions and words looked shrewd and experienced, but his actions were always crazy and unexpected. A moment ago he had been amiably going to Hongling with him. The next moment he had suddenly turned hostile and created such a terrifying scene. Could this be some kind of scheme, a trap? Once this thought appeared in his mind, it grew wildly like weeds in spring. Yang Jianzi thought back carefully to what had just happened. He felt even more that he couldn't see through it. Once he couldn't see through it, a terrifying warning rose in his heart. As soon as he sensed the danger, he slowed down a little. His gains from this trip could be considered quite fruitful. At least he had seen Li Yunxin once and roughly understood his personality. He had also obtained some information. Under these circumstances, he hesitated for 2 breaths with caution in his heart, thinking about whether or not to give chase. After 2 breaths he finally gave up on this thought. Li Yunxin had truly gone far away. He wasn't going in the direction of Rongqing. Instead he was going in the direction of the Qin kingdom. In reality, when Li Yunxin's dragon body was about to disappear from sight, Yang Jianzi had raised his hand twice to activate his array. Just as he was hesitating about whether or not to continue chasing, he was also hesitating about whether or not this was the result the other person wanted. Finally, the cheese kiss disappeared with the cloud. Many people saw the strange phenomenon in the sky. In the sky that was originally dyed red by the setting sun, a large mass of warm orange clouds suddenly moved at a rather obvious speed. Moreover, the color of this warm cloud became darker and darker, and finally turned into a large mass of lightning storm clouds. In the end, the cloud went far away, leaving a long trail in the sky, as if a divine dragon had swept across the sky. In the eyes of the secular world, such a scene was like the Dragon King showing his divinity, especially the Prince Rong Zhaoxing in the city. However, some people, such as the Qingshui people who lived in the backyard of Munanju, could see the truth to a certain extent. At the very least, she knew that it wasn't a Shinryu but a Qi kiss. So it's like this. She stood barefoot in the courtyard and looked up at the orange-red sky. She looked like a 13 or 14-year-old girl who saw something beautiful and novel for the first time. However, what she was looking at was not birds or flowers, but Qi Wen's real body. But he only saw it for an instant. The hearing and eyesight of cultivators were good, but there was still a limit. Without the help of magic, it was impossible to see things thousands of meters away. When Li Yunxin's real body finally disappeared, she blinked, narrowed her eyes and then gave up. She sighed in a low voice. It seemed that she was regretting that she couldn't clearly see his real face. In the red ridge outside Rong City, Taoist Jackal also noticed the situation in the sky. At that time, this demon cultivator was listening to Xiaoyaozi's lecture in the bamboo house. In Taoist Jackal's eyes, this ignorant and incompetent guy was quite dissatisfied with Yang Jianzi leaving the Red Ridge without telling him where he was going. He had been nagging him for more than 2 hours. Taoist Jackal listened respectfully like his palace master, and when he was extremely impatient he glanced at the sky outside the window. Then he saw the bright dark cloud and the long trail that followed. He sighed in a low voice, deeply worried, not knowing if his palace master's work was going smoothly. That cloud should be a fight between the two sides. But Xiaoyaozi didn't seem to notice. Taoist Jackal already knew this guy's background. In fact, he could really be considered a liar. This guy had only learned some superficial qi training methods, which could barely be considered better than ordinary Jianghu martial artists. But it didn't seem that he was that good. He didn't doubt that a second-rate master could fight him to a draw, and a first-rate master could easily take his life. In the past 5 years he hadn't seen him cultivate, nor had he seen him use magic. Taoist Jackal had sent people to test him several times, and finally realized that this guy wasn't hiding his strength, but really couldn't use it. Such a person, relying on the power of the Freemasonry, pretended to be arrogant in front of his palace master and said some nonsense. Even now, he didn't notice what was happening in the sky, and was still chattering until his own mouth and tongue became dry. Then he waved his hand, telling Taoist Jackal to leave. However, after the angry demon cultivator walked out of the door, the unfettered one slowly stood up and walked to the window. At this time the sky had become even darker. The orange-red color gradually faded, turning into a cold, deep blue. Some bright stars appeared, and the bright cloud trail left by Li Yunxin became dim because of the disappearance of the setting sun, eventually disappearing into the night sky. But Xiaoyaozi stood by the window and looked up at the sky for a while. Then he slowly raised his hand and drew a line in the air. It was the direction in which Li Yunxin had gone. When Li Yunxin turned into a gust of cold wind and entered through the window, Lu Laodao was draining the last drop of wine from the pot. There was only one empty lamp on the table in front of him. This was a large house, beautifully decorated. In the past, this should have been the place where Lord Dongting entertained guests. But now that it was autumn, this large house seemed cold and gloomy. Lord Dongting and his servants who used to live here naturally didn't need to keep warm, but Lu Laodao couldn't. So he put a copper stove in the house and burned some charcoal. At this time the house was warm, but it was smoky and the smell was really unpleasant. When he appeared, old Taoist Lu's hand that was holding the pot was still in place. He stared blankly at Li Yunxin for a while and then hurriedly said, "The Heavenly King covers the earth. Puruosi, don't talk to anyone. I'm busy to death." Li Yunxin sat down in front of him and waved his hand. "It's me. Don't do it again." Lu Laodao frowned slightly and repeated Li Yunxin's words in his heart. After confirming that there wasn't much difference between what he remembered and what he had remembered, he finally let out a sigh of relief. But soon he became anxious again. Why did Brother Xin suddenly come back? Did he receive my letter? Is it because of those 2 Taoist priests? Li Yunxin sat down and stared at Lu Laodao for a while. Then he sighed. "I'm in big trouble." Chapter 331. Li Yunxin rarely looked worried in front of Laodao. Even if sometimes Laodao could tell that he hid his worries under his unbridled or cynical face. He rarely looked like this, with worries written all over his face. So this made Laodao's heart tremble slightly. He opened his mouth but didn't know what to say for a moment. At this time Li Yunxin sighed again and said, "How have you been these days?" There was tension and anxiety between his brows that couldn't be concealed. But Laodao felt that the anxiety wasn't caused by any imminent crisis. Li Yunxin's mind was deeper than anyone he had ever met, so he couldn't make wild guesses. All he could do was to tell the things that happened these days in detail, which Laodao knew was also some kind of comfort. "These days we went a little further north according to the way we dealt with the dragon cult, but we didn't gain much. The destruction of the city of Wei scared away the fairies nearby. Lao Dao got up as he spoke and walked to the copper stove, intending to boil a pot of water for Li Yunxin. Sanhua, Shuk and Sky are all in the north, according to Brother Exin, the Little Demon Protection Association. But about Sanhua, I don't understand why Brother Exin let her go since he's suspicious of her. But since you have your own plans, I won't say anything. Lao Dao put the pot of boiling water on the stove, bent down and poked the charcoal in the stove with the stove hook, and the fire burned up. That's all here. Before you left, you said that we'd just pretend, but I think Shuk and Sky are very attentive. They came back the day before yesterday and told me something. It seems that they've also recruited a dozen little demons, and it's said that one of them is even more powerful than him. The other thing is the matter in the south. The old Taoist turned to look at Li Yunxin. I went to the Jade Hill in the south yesterday. Lu Ling disappeared. Li Yunxin had been sitting at the table, staring at the table and listening to Lu Laodao. Hearing this, he finally seemed to be a little interested and softly said, "Oh." Then he raised his eyebrows slightly. "What's going on?" "Brother Exin told me to check on him every few days and I went yesterday. He's already gone." Na Jin, whom Brother Exin had mentioned, had been taken away without leaving behind any money or food. I took a closer look and I don't think he's been attacked by bad people. Lao Dao then walked to a cabinet on the west side of the house. He pulled open the drawer and rummaged through it. "I've searched the surroundings but I didn't find any corpses." He left on his own. Then he turned around and showed the thing he found to Li Yunxin. "You said that if he's really gone I should take this back. He didn't take this with him." What he found in the cupboard was a peachwood plate. The color was black and the words carved on it were blurred. Clearly it was quite old. This thing was common in the kingdom of Qing and even in the southern countries. Families would hang palm-sized plates made of peachwood under the eaves of their houses, and on them were carved words like, "fish in a bountiful year," and "good luck." One reason was to pray for good luck and the other was to ward off evil. Presumably, this plate had been hanging under the eaves for a long time without anyone taking care of it. The plate had been moldy and then dried. No one knew how many years it had been like this, but it was cracked and black. Li Yunxin waved his hand and the peachwood plate flew into his palm. Then he rubbed his two fingers together and the wood was crushed into pieces. The pieces fell to the ground, revealing a talisman inside. Lu Laodao opened his mouth in shock. He hadn't expected Li Yunxin to leave something like this behind. It's also an idle move. Li Yunxin pinched the talisman and looked at it for a while. The worry in his eyes lessened slightly. It was as if the matter regarding Lu Ling had distracted his attention and made him temporarily focus on something else. Lu Ling Kongzi. Although her snow mountain and sea of qi are destroyed and she can't cultivate magic, her knowledge is still there. For the Daotong Kenzo she's useless, but for others. Lu Laodao had already slowly walked over and sat beside him. He stared at the talisman in his hand. "The Freemasonry?" "Yes. For the Freemasonry it's probably still very useful." Li Yunxin stood up and slowly walked to the side of the copper stove. He stretched out his hand and warmed it thoughtfully. "I've seen Qing Kuangzi, Fu Kuangzi, Tan Kuangzi and whatever Kuangzi. They all claim to be dual cultivators of the sword. They even say that they don't need to go through a tribulation to cultivate these things. I think so too. Those Kuangzi do speak and act like mortals with great power. But they're all ghosts, possessing other people's bodies. If one had to possess the body of a Yin spirit in order to cultivate their techniques, then Lu Ling would be a treasure to them. With experience, realm and comprehension, removing the obstacle of Snow Mountain and Sea of Qi, she'll probably advance by leaps and bounds. I didn't expect them to really take a fancy to her." "Did the Freemasonry take her away?" Lu Laodao said in surprise. "Brother Exin already knew?" Li Yunxin shook his head. "Guess. Ling Kongzi used to have a state of mind and didn't care about glory or favor. But now that she's immortal, her state of mind is gone. Thinking of her glory in the past and seeing how she's down and out now, it's hard for her to calm down. Someone like her has seen the most magical things in the world and has the most powerful power. In the past she didn't even care about gold, silver, jewelry and worldly power. Now not only is she gone, she's even worse off than mortals. If I were her, I'd definitely climb up by hook or by crook and not let go of any opportunity. She has such a thought: as long as the Freemasonry reaches out to her, she'll get up and leave. Look, she's gone now." Speaking of this, Li Yunxin threw the talisman in his hand into the fire. Now let's see if I'm right. The talisman quickly burned and a flame rose in the furnace. The flame quickly twisted and transformed into the appearance of people and scenery. Although they were all flames, there were red, yellow, blue and white which were still distinct and vivid. Therefore it reproduced the appearance of Cui Gang at a certain moment. This talisman will be activated when a ghost approaches, Li Yunxin said. I guess it's Lin Liangzi of the Freemasonry. He was there when I was in the city of Wei. Later he and Fu Liangzi killed Kun Wuzi and then there was no news of him. In the scene formed by the flame, one could roughly see the outline of Lu Ling. She seemed to be talking to someone. But she was talking to the air and her expression was uncertain with more fear than doubt. And the other person couldn't be seen, so it was probably a ghost. As for what was said, it couldn't be heard. After all, this was a talisman and also a small trick. Taoism was indeed magical, but some things in Li Yunxin's previous world were even more magical than Taoism. This was one of them. The two talked for about an hour. The flame ignited by the talisman gradually became unstable, as if it was about to extinguish. There didn't seem to be anything particularly surprising, but this meant that Li Yunxin's guess was correct. So, that group of people from the Freemasonry are also very arrogant. When the flame finally dissipated, Li Yunxin smiled faintly. They probably know that it's my chess piece, but they still want to find trouble for themselves. Sigh. Troublesome. When he said this word, his face, which had become slightly better, became ugly again. Chapter 332. Lu Laodao finally couldn't help but look at Li Yunxin. What happened to Brother Exen? Li Yunxin sighed again. How is she now? Laodao knew that he was still unwilling to say, perhaps because he didn't want to say, so he changed the topic again. But what Li Yunxin asked was also what Laodao often worried about. The she Li Yunxin mentioned was Shirquizi. Lu Laodao knew that his brother Exen was sometimes like a big child who threw a tantrum. If he asked too much, he might just leave in a huff. Therefore he only talked about his own matters first. He accompanied Li Yunxin and sighed, "You sealed her with a talisman before you left. These days I feel that the situation is not good. Seems that she is gone." Gone meant that she was dead. If it was a few months ago, Laodao would not have said it so lightly when he encountered "she is gone." For secular people, the boundary between life and death meant eternal separation, and it was something that human beings could not cross. However, in these few months he had seen many life and death situations. Therefore he knew that death did not mean the end for Xianmen. Maybe he could not do anything about it, but Li Yunxin would always have a way. He believed in him. Li Yunxin frowned and grunted. He thought for a while. It is expected. My talisman is not meant to protect life. It is only used to seal the soul and suppress the corpse. She is dead now, but her soul is sealed in the corpse by me. If you have the heart, go and talk to her often. Her soul is still conscious, but she is trapped in the corpse every day, suffering. Laodao was stunned for a while. Like this? I just thought she fainted. Is it like this? You know, when a person's soul is gone, the king of hell will come and bring her back. So there is no other way. Li Yunxin looked up at Lu Laodao and hesitated for a moment. I didn't do a good job with Sanhua's original body. Now I know another way which is better than my old one. But I haven't figured it out yet. For her own good, let's wait a little longer. Lu Laodao only sighed and agreed. The two of them remained silent for a few breaths. Li Yunxin coughed softly and raised her hand to touch her nose. How did you fall for him? His words were spoken quickly and lightly. Laodao frowned and grunted, thinking that he had misheard. Li Yunxin slowly reached out his hand and warmed himself by the fire. He leaned back slightly and stared intently at the bright red charcoal in the stove. He casually repeated, I mean the two of you. When did you fall in love with her? After that he muttered, it's autumn after all. He turned his finger and drew an incantation and flicked it into the fire. The flame rose with a boom and the light covered his face. This time Lu Laodao heard it clearly. His face was also illuminated by the fire. The fire was huge and the heat wave was overwhelming. This was not just a fire to warm himself, it was practically roasting him. His brother Exen had the body of a fiend god, so it wouldn't be a big deal even if he was burned by mortal fire for a while. However, he was different. So he hurriedly stepped back and sat down. He pondered for a while. Finally he realized that Li Yunxin might be in trouble again. Last time he thought that Li Yunxin was dead, so he took refuge in Shirkuizi's Nanshan Mountain God Temple. But Li Yunxin broke in the middle of the night and sat there without saying a word. He asked him, "What is Red Lady's plan?" His expression at that time was very similar to what he was now. But he had only been away for a few days and he had already gotten himself into such a dissolute relationship. For a moment Lao Dao didn't know what to say. He was not a dissolute person. He didn't know much more than ordinary people about the affairs between men and women. But when Lao Dao looked at Li Yunxin like this, a different kind of feeling arose in his heart. He and Li Yunxin were master, servant, teacher and friend. It was hard to say who was in front and who was behind these four, also words. Sometimes he was like an older apprentice to Li Yunxin and sometimes he was like an elder who took care of him. They were originally two people who wandered the ends of the earth coming together. Now for Lao Dao and Li Yunxin, the two of them were probably the only people in the world who could take out the words in their hearts and talk about them in detail. Therefore the feeling that would often arise in his heart in the past was born again. A little sad and a little gratified. It was like an old grandfather who saw his powerful grandson being woken up by a nightmare at night and kicking away the quilt. So he slowly walked over and softly coaxed him to sleep. He knew that his brother Exen was now in trouble that made him panic, and came back to hide. Therefore even though he felt embarrassed to say, like or not directly at his age and experience, he still had to keep a straight face at this moment. He just acted as if he had heard some ordinary gossip. He cleared his throat and said, "About this matter. I can't remember clearly. It's been more than 10 years. It's hard to say when I fell in love with her and when I had those thoughts in my heart. If two people didn't know each other before and didn't have any impression of each other, how could they, fall in love with each other after meeting each other? They got along with each other for a long time slowly. This thing is like melting ice and snow. It's hard to say when it started to melt. But Brother Exen, did you meet a girl you like?" Lao Dao was still not used to saying the word like. But at least he was able to straighten his tongue and speak these words smoothly. Then he casually asked a few questions, treating it as a small talk or something like, "Tomorrow we should go to the north to see the demons there." After he said this, Li Yunxin was silent for a while. His face was hidden behind the firelight so Lao Dao couldn't see it. After a while he heard him cough. "I don't know." Lao Dao thought he might have such an answer, but he didn't expect it to be true. According to his understanding of Li Yunxin, once he said, "I don't know," it was almost equivalent to yes. He was surprised for a while and couldn't help but ask, "Which girl has such ability? Is it Bai Yunxin?" "How could it be?" Li Yunxin answered immediately. Lao Dao's curiosity was aroused. "Then which one have you met before?" After a while, Li Yunxin said behind the firelight, "I've never met her before." Lao Dao was surprised again. "You've never met her before? Why do you like her?" Li Yunxin suddenly stood up, and the strong wind caused by his movement shook the firelight. Their shadows also danced on the wall. "When did you say you like her?" Lao Dao quickly raised his hand. Okay, I won't say that. But since Brother Exan asked me, you should at least tell me the whole story." "Lao Dao, the things about me, well, Brother Exan knows all about it. What's there to be embarrassed about when it's your business? Now the two of us can be said to be companions and depend on each other." Hearing these words, Li Yunxin's expression softened again. He stared straight at old Taoist Lu for a while, then raised his hand and waved, suppressing the strong fire in the stove. Then he sighed and sat down. "Yes. Isn't that so? But my things." He frowned and tapped the bamboo fan on his palm. "My matters will take a long time to talk about." He paused and stared at the firelight for a while, then finally said, "There are some people who can't feel emotions. I used to be that kind of person." Lao Dao knew that Li Yunxin was finally willing to talk about the things that had been hidden in his heart for a long time. Thus he accompanied him and talked about it like before so that he wouldn't feel discouraged. So he also sighed in a low voice, "AI. Humans are not plants. How can we be emotionless? The sorrowful things of the past are in the past." However, Li Yunxin shook his head. "When I said I can't feel emotions, it's not what you mean. I really can't feel it. All right, I used to teach you the study of the heart. This can be considered as an example of the study of the heart. I've told you before what psychological reasons and physiological reasons are. What I'm talking about now is a physiological reason. Hearing this, Lao Dao didn't fully understand. However, he already knew that Li Yunxin was trying to use other methods to hide his emotions. Originally, he said that he didn't want to think about his life, but now he said that he was teaching him the study of the heart. Using himself as an example, perhaps it wouldn't be so embarrassing to talk about it. Lao Dao was a clever person. At this time, he understood Li Yunxin's thoughts. He nodded. All right, Brother X, and tell me about it. Lao Dao, I will learn more. Li Yunxin smiled. Then let's not talk about serotonin and the like. It will take a long time to explain. I just want to say that some people are born with a different or incomplete brain compared to ordinary people. As a result, they can't feel the emotions of ordinary people. They can't feel. For example, when a person grows up to 10 years old, he still can't distinguish between a smiling face and an angry face. Many of the emotions that ordinary people are born with, he has to slowly remember and carefully distinguish them before he can understand them. Lao Dao frowned slightly. Li Yunxin thought for a moment. For example, you walk into an alley at night and see two robbers robbing a woman. You stand there for a while and one of the robbers sees you. With a face full of anger, he turns around and points his knife at you from afar. Tell me, what does he mean? Lao Dao's frown deepened. After thinking carefully for a while, he said tentatively, could it be telling me to go away and not meddle in other people's business? He felt that the answer was too simple. This was definitely not what Li Yunxin wanted to ask. However, he couldn't think of anything else at the moment. However, Li Yunxin smiled faintly. That's exactly what I mean. Ordinary people would think that way. But for that kind of person, maybe he should be stunned first. Pausing for a moment, he tried to recall the expression on that scoundrel's face. Oh, it meant that he was angry. Then think about it again. What does he want to do by pointing a knife at me? But how does he know? When a person points at another person, he might have something to talk about, or he might just point at random, or he might be pointing at the person behind him. How does he know what the robber is pointing at him? Lao Dao was indeed attracted by this example. He frowned and thought for a while, then asked doubtfully, but the robber is committing a crime. Doing such a thing, he is naturally afraid of being seen. Now that he has seen it, he should know that the robber is just threatening him. That's the problem. Li Yunxin paused and said softly, ordinary people think that robbing people with knives is bad. But what if the robber doesn't think it's bad? He doesn't know that robbing people and cutting people with knives is a bad thing. What if he can't understand the feeling of the person who is being robbed and cut with a knife? Lao Dao was stunned for a while, slightly understanding the meaning of what Li Yunxin said, and then he was stunned. There really is such a person? Li Yunxin looked down at the charcoal fire in the stove, picked up the stove hook and poked it. Then he said softly, I am that kind of person. Lao Dao didn't know what to say for a while, only to hear Li Yunxin continue softly and slowly. That example is a little exaggerated. In fact, when I was a child, I was like that. I didn't feel pain often and I was numb to everything. It was hard for me to understand other people's emotions and behaviors, and I had to think carefully to understand what other people did instinctively. So I was treated as a retard. The place I lived in when I was a child was not a good place. A group of children, big and small, gathered together. No one cared about them. Retards were always bullied. Beating, scolding, not giving them food, these were all common things. Ordinary people might find it hard to bear, living a life worse than death. But at that time, I didn't feel anything. I didn't feel pain very much. When people scolded me, laughed at me, I didn't know what they meant. I didn't know what they meant, and of course I wasn't afraid or sad. When someone was nice to me, secretly giving me food, I didn't feel anything. I didn't know what that person meant by being nice to me. It was just a shell. Ordinary people's shells are filled with emotions and desires, but I don't. Li Yunxin stopped and thought for a while. So I came here. My cultivation is very fast. Those Taoist priests want to go through tribulations to abandon their emotions and desires. I've already experienced what they do. Taoist priests want to forget their emotions. Swordsmen also want to forget their emotions. They cultivate for hundreds of years to achieve this result. I was born like that in the past. Lao Dao was dumbfounded. He really didn't know what to say. He stared at Li Yunxin for a long time before he squeezed out a sentence with difficulty. So now, Li Yunxin smiled. Now? Now is naturally now. But at that time, what should I do? People say that I'm retarded, but I'm not. In fact, I'm smarter than those people. It's just that I have a lot of things to observe, to learn and to think about. For example, later on I slowly realized that someone was waving his fist at me, intending to hit me. Ordinary people would be afraid and hide when they see it. As for me, I first saw him waving his fist at me, then thought about several possibilities, what he was probably going to do. Then, according to the environment and situation at that time, I found the most likely one from these possibilities. Then I thought about how they would react when they encountered this possibility. Will they laugh, or will they scream, or will they cry? After thinking about so many things, I reacted, pretending to be afraid and hiding. As I slowly grew up, I slowly became proficient in these things. So, they said that I had grown up and my mind had changed. Actually, it's just that I need to learn more things compared to them. When they do something unintentionally, I have to think about dozens of things in my mind. Li Yunqing lowered his head and thought about it. After a few years, I gradually realized those around me were a bunch of idiots. In my eyes, they were extremely stupid, like kittens or puppies. After a few years, it became easier for me to know what they were thinking and what they might do, because their unintentional emotions and actions had actually been simulated and analyzed in my mind for so many years. There were so many possibilities, I had to think about them one by one. Li Yunqing turned to look at Lu Laodao. Later on, I was adopted by someone. My conditions were better. I had clean clothes, I could eat my fill, and I could sleep peacefully. After that, I read some books and did some things. I found out that not everyone in the world is like cats and dogs. There are still some people who are as smart as me. Those people wrote some things, works, theories, some of which I found funny, some of which I found very reasonable. So, in the end, I became a psychiatrist. He stopped and thought for a while. He seemed to find it very funny. I went to talk about feelings and give guidance to others. You see, this is the power of knowledge. He was silent for a while and slightly raised his head as if he was thinking about the past. I came here. You asked me what I am now. I am now an ordinary person. But do you know why a person is Zhang San and not Li Si, Wang Wu or Zhao Lu? Why? The Freemasons ran around to take over bodies, changing their gender and body. How can they prove that they are themselves? It's memory. When I came to this world, I carried the memory of the past. The feeling of the past. The feeling of numbness and emptiness, the feeling of not knowing what feelings are, all stuffed into an ordinary person's head. Li Yunqing frowned slightly. I can understand ordinary people's feelings, but I can't completely understand ordinary people's feelings. Past experiences and memories are in the middle. So when I was in the city of Wei, that Yunzi mistook me as hatred. He came to the side yard and told me something about renouncing feelings and abandoning desires, about recultivating and about Taoist heart. What a joke. Those people need Taoist heart and go through tribulations. Isn't it just to become what I used to be? Li Yunqing smiled and shook his head. Those are the things I played with. I don't need to renounce feelings and abandon desires. I understand that feeling. I don't need any Taoist heart. At least I used to think so. Lu Laodao was already dumbfounded listening to him. At this moment, when Li Yunqing mentioned Taoist heart, he suddenly came to a realization. In the past? Brother Xian's trouble now is this Taoist heart? Li Yunqing was silent for a while and sighed. Yes. A situation that I didn't expect. To me, it was a feeling that was extremely unfamiliar. If I were an ordinary person, I would have plenty of opportunities to try and make mistakes. But now I am a demon cultivator in the true state. One wrong step and I may be doomed eternally. Chapter 333. At this point, Lu Laodao really didn't know what to say. An hour ago he thought that Li Yunqing was troubled by love affairs. But now he realized that love affairs were a disaster for the current Li Yunqing. This meant, in the past I was like a piece of paper. Li Yunqing frowned and looked out of the window. There was nothing on the paper. I came to this world. Fortunately, I was born sensible and my parents were immortal cultivators. So when I was very young, I learned about cultivation, how to renounce emotions and desires, and how to pass the tribulation. There's nothing fun in this world. Cultivation is a fun thing. So I decided to cultivate. Originally, there were those barriers in my mind, so I was ignorant about the feelings of the world. Plus, I consciously controlled it. So I lived for 15 years without writing anything on this paper. But in this life I'm an ordinary person. Some emotions have to be slowly infiltrated. For example, I only treat you well. It's also because of some memories of the past. These things and emotions were not really that big of a deal. Because although I didn't experience it before, I know a thing or two from other people's experiences. But there's another kind of emotion that I couldn't learn in the past. Li Yunxin paused and spoke even more slowly. The strong love between men and women. Completely different from other emotions. I treat you well because you're like an old man I met before. Without him, I probably wouldn't be able to read and understand the wisdom of smart people. I can also make a few friends because I can also experience the feeling of good friends like blood brothers. But there's only this thing called love. Two people are complete strangers. Not the love between parents and brothers, there's no blood relationship. But from strangers to familiarity and from familiarity to love, it's hard to part and it's hard to control. When love is so deep, it can even cause a person to hurt themselves and sacrifice themselves. And all this is because of love and love. But why is this? Why do you love and love me so much? Li Yunxin paced a few steps by the stove, then turned to look at Lu Laodao. In my old world there was a saying. When it comes to love, you can actually find the root of it. It's just the combination of hormones in the human brain. You could even adjust and control the hormones in a person's brain, and that person could immediately fall in love with a person that he had hated so much before. I came here precisely because I know this method. That's why I feel that the Taoist priest and the swordsman's practice of renouncing their emotions and abandoning their desires is utterly stupid. If it was in my original world, I would have been able to achieve the supreme oblivion with just a few tricks. But then I met Red Lady. Farewell to the Freemasons, Tanaka and Fukuzensu. The three of them were no longer human. In the words of my previous world, people who don't even have the basic structure to produce hormones in their brains, but still know about love. What's the reason? Because you understand a person and become interested in her, you become more and more curious. In the end, although you didn't meet that person, you already have that person's appearance in your heart. Her every move, every frown and every smile are in your mind. So at a certain moment, you feel that you have to let go or forget her, and you feel inexplicably sad and melancholy. Why is this? After listening to Li Yunxin, Lao Dao was silent for a while, then said in a low voice, Brother Exin, don't you already know? This is love and love. Li Yunxin gritted his teeth and looked out of the window. Yes, I already know. That's why I'm in trouble. I have such a strong desire and I know what it feels like. I also have to renounce my emotions and abandon my desires. Maybe I also need some kind of Taoist heart. But Brother Xian said before that you have subconsciously controlled your emotions. How did you come to this step today? Lu Laodao looked at him doubtfully. From what you said, you liked or admired that woman for a long time. During this time, didn't you notice it? Didn't you try to stop? Li Yunxin's expression became strange, as if he was hesitating whether to say something or not. Finally, he looked at Lu Laodao and remembered what Laodao had said before. The two of us now can be considered companions relying on each other for survival. He sighed in a low voice. It's a long story. That person, I thought she was a man. Li Yunxin sat down dejectedly by the copper stove again, rubbing his forehead. These days I have seen a lot of traces left by that person and I feel that she is one of the few people in this world with interesting stories. You know, there are many idiots in this world and there are also many idiots who don't know they are idiots. It's very boring and depressing. But that person, alas. One thing at a time I slowly understand her. Because of those things I tried to guess to think about her. Damn it. That's right. Liking and admiring someone really starts from curiosity. I used all my thoughts to speculate about that person's thoughts and behavior. I unknowingly and forcefully trapped myself in it. But at that time, what else could I do? My life was in danger. I wanted to live, I wanted to find a way to survive, so I had to pay attention to her. At this point, Lu Laodao finally couldn't help but interrupt him. Who is Brother Exin talking about? Why do I feel that? This person is also somewhat familiar to me. Li Yunxin paused and looked straight at him. Of course you are familiar with her. This person is the art saint. The expression on Lu Laodao's face instantly became interesting, so interesting that even Li Yunxin couldn't describe it. He widened his eyes as if he had seen a ghost, as if the Li Yunxin in front of him had suddenly become a stranger. Because he didn't know how to express his current thoughts. But Li Yunxin shook his head and sighed again. You think I don't know and I haven't tried to prevent this? Just 4 hours ago I was in Chengdu, in the sky above Chengdu. I met a guy called Yang Jianzi. He told me about the art saint. He said he knew the inside story. At that time my heart turned upside down. I knew this emotion was not right. I was too curious about the art saint, too sensitive. This emotion had gone beyond the scope of paying attention to him for the sake of living. So guess what happened to me? Li Yunxin kicked the ground with the tip of his foot irritably. Do you remember I told you there is a method called aversion therapy? For example, you put a rubber band on your wrist and use the rubber band to flick yourself when you want to do something. After that, this painful experience will be associated with what you want to do, and it can make you abstain from certain things. So guess what happened to me? I knew that his Hongling was full of danger, but I still said to him, I'll go. Li Yunxin sighed. I think I'm a smart person and I can try to give myself hints. I went to Hongling because of my abnormal attention to the art saint, and then came back with a big loss. This is my own aversion therapy. I can try to adjust myself with this method. I know this emotion has to stop. But he suddenly told me that the art saint is a woman. Li Yunxin stopped and stared at the fire. He did not speak for a full quarter of an hour. Finally, amid the crackling of the charcoal in the fire, he said in a low voice, Then I knew it was not good. Before that, someone had done enough preparation and foreshadowing and told me to step into it step by step. At this time anyone could let me know the truth. Who's done? Was tricked. I'm in big trouble. Lu Laodao's mind was in a mess because of the shock. After a long time after Li Yunxin stopped talking, he gradually realized the even more shocking information hidden in his words. Preparation and foreshadowing? Step into it? Tricked? Lu Laodao was dumbfounded. What do you mean, Brother Xian? Are you saying that you fell in love with the art saint because you fell into someone's trap? How could there be such a trap? Li Yunxin stared at the fire and slowly squeezed out the words from his teeth. If it weren't for what happened today, I would have forgotten the details. At first it was in the city of Wei Qianghua building in Lingkongzi. When I was at the Qianghua gathering I had asked Lingkongzi to let down his guard. But just because I accidentally mentioned the jade slip of illumination she immediately became alert. That was definitely not the alertness that a normal person should have. I knew at that time that someone had built a defense mechanism in her heart. When she was under the influence of my suggestion, I mentioned that word and triggered the defense mechanism. She immediately woke up. That person was a master. I knew it at that time. He paused and said, Then in Dongting. Lord Dongting and my brother didn't hear anything related to possession. At that time I thought it was a spell. Now who knows whether it was a spell or a mind study or the interaction of the two. There was a person, I'm not sure who targeted me early. It might even be as early as when my parents were still alive. Then from the moment I stepped into the city of Wei he led me into this trap step by step. Today 4 hours ago the trap was closed. My Taishang Wang Qing was broken. The old Taoist was once again dumbfounded and did not speak for a long time. He believed in Li Yunxin's judgment for many things. And the fact proved that Li Yunxin's judgment was completely correct. There was only one thing. He felt that his brother Exin might have made a mistake in this field that he had never touched. He knew that Li Yunxin was a capable person. In fact, he had no doubt that Li Yunxin could one day be famous in the world and establish a school. But it was one day after all. But now, his brother Exin was a great fiendish demon at the True Realm. He was considered a rather powerful character. But who was this powerful compared to? For example, in the Qin kingdom, there was a person who was a magistrate or a provincial magistrate. Naturally, he was a powerful person compared to them small commoners. But compared to those bureaucrats, there were those who were not as good as him and those who were far better than him. But compared to the emperor, how could the emperor truly care about a magistrate or provincial magistrate? That was the painting saint. Compared to the world, was it not the emperor to the Qin kingdom? The old Taoist knew from the bottom of his heart that his brother Exin would soar to the sky one day, but it was hard for him to believe that he had been set up by someone at this time to make him fall in love with the art saint. In Lao Dao's view, it seemed that Li Yunxin had panicked and lost his footing because of a feeling he had never experienced before. Thus, he was anxious to find a plausible reason for himself. Li Yunxin was a very intelligent person. He remembered many clues and had the ability to connect many clues together. Usually, this ability allowed him to see through an enemy's thoughts and strategies. But at this time, this ability allowed him to create a powerful enemy for himself that did not exist. From the moment he entered the city of Wei, he had been scheming against him without him knowing until today when the scheme had succeeded. How could someone have such skill and skill? This was like saying that it was raining from the sky and soaking one's clothes. Someone had purposely created this rain and used it to their advantage. But Lao Dao hid these words in his heart and did not say them out loud. In reality, just thinking about it made him feel sad. Li Yunxin was such a proud and powerful person. But when he encountered the matter of falling in love with someone, he panicked to this extent. He was anxious to find a reason to absolve himself and use it to release pressure. This was a common phenomenon in the study of the mind that he had taught himself. But now, Li Yunxin had become such a person. He sighed from the bottom of his heart. As he thought about Li Yunxin's past and present, what kind of difficult days she must have gone through when she didn't know what love was, he slowly said, "But all cultivators can go through the tribulation of love. Brother Xian is not completely helpless now. He can also go through the ordeal of love." Li Yunxin snorted and laughed. "Go through the ordeal? I'm afraid you've fallen into that person's trap. That person has schemed against me for so long and I didn't notice it at all. He should have guessed that I would have to go through the ordeal if I was really like this. Go through the ordeal with the art saint. Even if there is a way, where can I go?" He took a deep breath. "I can't go according to his plan. If I want to get out of it, I have to find another way." Lao Dao sighed in his heart again. He did not want to say things like, "You are to the art saint what a small official is to the emperor. Why would anyone use this kind of thing to plot against you? Your thinking is too ridiculous." But he also could not see Li Yunxin panicking like this and making an imaginary enemy for himself. After all, their current situation was not good. Although they had slightly retreated from the edge of life and death and barely did not have to worry about their lives, this short period of peace and happiness was also under the situation that there was going to be a big battle between the Taoists and the demons. This kind of peace could disappear at any time. He frowned again and finally remembered one thing. Maybe he could temporarily divert Li Yunxin's attention and calm down for a while. Chapter 334. He had heard of this matter by chance, but only regarded it as a rumor because he thought it was too absurd. However, now Li Yunxin's idea seemed even more absurd to him than that matter. Saying it out so seriously at this critical juncture could be considered a plan of fighting poison with poison. So he coughed softly, interrupting Li Yunxin's contemplation. "Speaking of the current situation, I have heard of another thing. I thought it might be related to what you think, but I thought it was nonsense before, so I didn't say it." At this moment, Li Yunxin was like a tightened spring. Anything to do with stratagem touched his sensitive nerve. So he immediately turned to look at him. "What is it? Tell me." "It's related to the original owner of this place," Lao Dao said slowly, and at the same time tried to say some nonsense, so that Li Yunxin would slowly calm down while listening to him. "The owner of this place, Lord Dongting, didn't he leave the barrier and go to Xinryu a few days ago? Then the news is related to him. A few days ago Taoist Shuk came back and mentioned it in passing. They learned it from a few small demons. When I heard it at that time, I thought, how could those small demons know this kind of news? So I just thought that those small demons were also talking nonsense, so I didn't mention it just now." Then he began to ramble. For example, how the rat spirit Shuk came back that day, what the weather was like, what his clothes were like, how he felt at the time, what he was thinking, what he was doing. All kinds of things, big or small, mixed with some long-winded, repeatedly emphasized nonsense. At first, Li Yunxin was anxious to listen, frowning. But after a while, it seemed that he was not anxious anymore. The fire in this room danced and the chill gradually faded. Lao Dao forced himself to say this nonsense for half an hour, and then slowly turned to the main topic. "Just say that Lord Dongting was killed by Xinryu. It was said that when it was killed, it revealed its true form, which was even bigger than a mountain. It was also said that Xinryu lived on an island in the middle of the Ruo Sea. In that case, the Lord Dongting's body was actually the size of the island." The little demons described these events vividly, as if they had seen it with their own eyes. "I thought about it carefully just now, and I suddenly feel that this matter is unusual. I've never seen the true body of the Lord Dongting. But Brother Xian, you told me before, it's really huge, like an island. Those little demons had never seen it before, so how would they know such details? Thus he asked those lesser demons how they knew about it. However, many of those demons with low cultivation levels had only just taken human form. They could not even speak clearly and could only say that they had heard it from others. So I asked a few more questions and the result was even more surprising. It seems like all the demons nearby know about this except for us. From this, it could be seen how widespread the news was. If the Lord Dongting was really killed in the Ruoxi, then where is the Ruoxi? It's said that it's in the easternmost region and no one has ever been there before. Isn't the Ruoxi tens of thousands of miles away from here? Doesn't that mean that all the demons in the world know about this matter? As he spoke, he looked at Li Yunxin's expression. At this moment, Li Yunxin was sitting in front of the copper stove, one arm on the table, the other on his leg. He squinted his eyes, listening to him. The light from the fire cast a shadow on his face, making his eyes look especially dark. His pupils were huge, like two small black holes. When Lao Dao said this, Li Yunxin blinked a few times and calmly asked, what's going on? Lao Dao stood up, walked in front of Li Yunxin and stayed silent for a while. Then he slowly said with a very gentle voice, think about it. This kind of big matter, but even a little demon knows about it, is it reasonable? Li Yunxin thought for a while and said in a low voice, it's not reasonable. The old Taoist then said, then think about it again. When something is too bizarre, does it mean that this matter is indeed very strange, or, when we were thinking about this matter, we might have taken a wrong turn and thought in the wrong direction? Li Yunxin was silent for a while, blinked a few times in confusion as if he was thinking about a difficult problem. Lao Dao didn't rush him, only stood in front of him, quietly watching him think. After a few seconds, Li Yunxin said, yes. Took a wrong turn, thought in the wrong direction. Hearing this, Lao Dao's expression suddenly relaxed. As if the previously tense breath was released, even his forehead was sweating. He didn't know whether it was because of extreme nervousness or because of exhaustion. From the time he told Li Yunxin about the Lord Dongting matter until now, a total of 3/4 of an hour had passed. However, these 3/4 of an hour were rarely long in his life. He forced himself to gather the last bit of spirit, took a deep breath and finally said, yes. So now you need to have a good rest. Go take a rest, take a look outside the window. Look outside the window, the moonlight is like water, the night is also clear. Listen to the sound of the waves. You will slowly feel that this kind of night is quiet and warm. Now that you have thought it through, there is no more worry in your heart. Why don't you take a good rest and sleep? Lao Dao bent down and looked into Li Yunxin's eyes. One hand slowly reached over to support his back, and the other hand gently placed on his forehead. Sleep for a while. I'll sleep until the sun rises. His hand moved down and closed Li Yunxin's eyes. Li Yunxin was like a puppet whose strings were pulled. His body suddenly went limp and fell into his arms. So he began to dream. The dream was clear and realistic. But the light in the dream was a little cold and a little dark, like the early morning when the sky was not completely bright. He stood in front of a door in a corridor. The floor of the corridor was covered with a scarlet carpet. The carpet was so thick that one could not hear any sound when he lightly stamped his feet. There were cameras on the wall. Within 10 steps there were 2 small cameras aimed at the door. No one could escape the eyes of the watchers. This door was a wooden door wrapped in genuine leather. It was not as strong as those cheap, roughly welded iron bars, and seemed to be a prop used by the owner of this door to show off his wealth and taste. Li Yunxin pushed the door open. Behind the door was a study. From the decoration to the layout, it showed that the owner of the study had amazing wealth, but was not completely used to it. The owner sat behind the wide table, frowning and playing with something in his hand. The thing was dark and slightly shiny. Li Yunxin stared at it for a while, and it took him some time to realize that it was called a gun. His mind was still very slow and his senses were numb. He saw the man behind the table turn his head and say something to him. But the voice seemed to come from the horizon, faintly discernible. He heard every word that the man said, but he did not know what the content was. Then suddenly, his consciousness suddenly became sharp, as if his soul had returned to his body. So he remembered what he should do in an instant. He was a doctor. That man was his patient. However, he did not appear here today to listen to his complaints, nor to comfort his desperate and ruthless heart, like he did in the past 2 years. To kill him, after making him suffer for half a year. This was his goal. Li Yunqing was stunned for a second. Then when the man raised his voice impatiently, he strode in front of him. He raised a hand, snapped his fingers and said only 3 words, "Follow me." Thus, the man who was waving the gun in his hand and shouting impatiently at Li Yunqing quietened down in an instant. Then he nodded and put down the gun. Like a friendly ordinary person he walked to Li Yunqing and smiled, revealing 6 teeth. "Dr. Li, let's go." Then, the scene jumped into a room. The room had no windows, was dark and cold, and was only illuminated by an incandescent lamp on the ceiling. The man was chained to the wall, like a chained dog. He only had 1 foot left. His other foot was gone and half of his calf was gone. The wound was carefully bandaged and there was no trace of blood. This seemed to mean that the wound had healed. Then the man heard the door open. He immediately widened his eyes and gritted his teeth. He seemed to be so afraid that he could not even retreat. Or perhaps he knew that it would be useless to retreat. He could not escape at all. Li Yunqing pushed the door open and walked in. In his left hand he carried a yellowed medicine box. In his right hand he carried an axe. The blade of the axe gleamed coldly. He stared at the man for a while and said with a smile, "I've finished eating." When the first ray of sunlight shone into the room, Li Yunqing suddenly sat up on the bed. He was stunned for a moment and then he saw outside the window. It was no longer dark but a blue sky. Right now he was sitting on the bed in the big room covered with a thin quilt. The sunlight was a little dazzling and his back was slightly damp as if he was sweating from sleep. He heard the faint sound of cicadas. He heard the sound of water birds. He widened his eyes and turned to look at the man sitting by the bed. Lu Laodao was also looking at him. His eyes were bloodshot and his lips were dry and chapped. His mouth trembled slightly for a while, and then he said as if he had made up his mind, "I hypnotized you. Last night I hypnotized you. I made you sleep well. I used the method that you taught me." Li Yunqing still stared at him as if he did not know what to say or do. The old Taoist priest took another deep breath. "To calm you down. You were hypnotized by me. Do you realize how out of control you were last night?" After he said that, after a long while, Li Yunqing slowly turned around, stepped on the ground and sat facing the old Taoist. Then he stared at Lu Laodao for a quarter of an hour before he suddenly sighed and looked down at his feet. "You're right. I lost my mind," he said in a low voice. "I lost my mind. So I should start working." Chapter 335. After saying that, Li Yunqing stood up. He walked a few steps and shook his robe as if to encourage himself. Then he stood by the window and stared at the lake in the distance. After a moment of silence he said, "I have to find that person. You are right, I lost my mind. In this world, even the so-called God, Black Bai Yanjun, is just a stronger creature. What is there to be afraid of about the person who schemed against me? Last night, I was probably scared." Lao Dao was stunned by the bedside. He did not expect that. Li Yunqing still persisted in that thought. He still thought that someone schemed against him. So he sighed in his heart and tried to speak again. "Brother Exon, there are some words." However, he suddenly felt a slight swelling in his ears before he could finish his words. It was a familiar feeling. It was as if someone had put his palms flat and pressed them against his ears. But the strange feeling did not stop there. He felt a slight itch on his body. It was as if the hairs on his body were attracted by something and all stood up. Therefore, the friction between the hairs on his body and the clothes on his body was both itchy and tingling. Lao Dao stopped talking because of this strange feeling. Li Yunqing was angry. He hypnotized him first, and now he doubted his deduction again. Li Yunqing was such a proud person and he did not have a good temper. He probably couldn't bear it anymore. But then he found that Li Yunqing's hair was floating. His black hair was originally hanging down his back, contrasting with his snow-white robe. But now when Lu Laodao saw Li Yunqing turn around, there was doubt in his eyes. A few strands of hair in front of his forehead were fluttering. Lu Laodao was actually familiar with this scene. In winter the weather was dry and everything was dry. When he took off his clothes at night, his clothes would make a crackling sound, and his hair would stick together. If he was not careful, his hair would be stung. Lao Dao was puzzled. In fact, it had only been a breath's time since he felt strange. Then he saw Li Yunqing's expression change. His brows were slightly furrowed and his eyes narrowed as he looked at himself. However, in the next moment his eyes suddenly widened, and his eyeballs rolled upwards as if he wanted to look at the sky. In Lu Laodao's eyes, Li Yunxin's next movement became very slow. He did not know if it was because his body instinctively sensed extreme danger and thus reacted before his consciousness. He saw Li Yunxin open his mouth, raise his hand, and his robe bulged with a boom. They also saw that Li Yunxin's fingertips were emitting golden spots of light in the void, which was the mysterious light when he was writing talismans out of thin air. They could also see Li Yunxin's appearance changing as he wrote. Steel-like scales grew out from his cheeks and his body also expanded. 2 red lights were about to shoot out from his forehead. The air became thicker and more viscous. His eardrums felt like they were about to burst. All of a sudden, everything became extremely quiet. Then, with a loud rumble, a bolt of lightning that was almost as thick as the entire house suddenly struck down. The Emperor Star Palace of the Lord Dongting was not an ordinary thing. Ordinary fire could not destroy it, and ordinary knives and axes could not leave a mark on it. Moreover, the palace was protected by several restrictive spells, making it even more impregnable. However, this big house in the middle of such a divine palace was instantly smashed by this huge bolt of lightning. The tiles, stones, and hardwood that had been enchanted were all turned into the tiniest powder in an instant. In the sky above the Emperor Star Palace, a vast expanse of golden light erupted. That was the ominous light that was released because the restriction outside the palace was shattered by the incomparably violent power. However, there was more than one bolt of lightning. At this moment, 1,000 meters above the Emperor Star Palace on the mountain of the Lord Dongting, a thick whirlpool-like cloud was rapidly expanding. Soon the sun and the blue sky could not be seen. From within this thick cloud, more than 100 lightning snakes struck down like a storm. The air around the entire Mount June became white because of this terrible power. Then clouds of fire spread out with a roar. Everything happened in the time of 2 breaths. 2 breaths ago the sun was shining on Mount June and the breeze was blowing. 2 breaths later the verdant plants on the island were all gone. The entire island changed from dark green to crimson red. Large tracts of bright red lava poured down from the top of the mountain like a waterfall and rushed into the lake. Because of this, the water in the lake evaporated and soared into the sky. The water was then penetrated by the dense curtain of lightning and turned into even more violent shock waves, setting off wave after wave of earth-shattering waves on the surface of the lake. However, in the midst of such a terrifying momentum, violent power, and thorough bombardment, the peak of Mount June that was already filled with boiling magma still had a grain of golden light that was the size of a grain of rice. It was blindingly bright. As the saying goes, a grain of rice also dares to compete with the sun and the moon. People often use this saying to laugh at fools who overestimated their own capabilities. But right now, this overwhelming curtain of lightning that was bombarding down was more than just the brilliance of the sun and the moon. They were so dazzling that this light could be seen from 100 or even 1,000 miles away. It made the morning sun hanging high in the sky appear dim. But that dot of golden light on the peak of the huge Mount June Island, actually burst out with a dazzling light that was not inferior to the others. The ground within a few feet around it was completely intact, like a lonely stone pillar that had popped out from the boiling sea of lava. At the top of this pillar, Li Yunxin, who had already revealed his fiend god body, was surrounded by clouds and mist. His hands held up to the sky. The densely packed golden runes around him flickered in and out of existence, rotating at high speed, forming a dazzling golden barrier around him. And in front of him floated 2 scrolls. It was the second of the Octadic Treasure's ancient scroll. These 2 treasures, which were even more powerful than spirit maps, were also emitting brilliant golden light by Li Yunxin. They resisted the terrifying power that came crashing down from the sky. Old Taoist Lu, on the other hand, stood beside him completely stunned. In the time of 2 breaths, he witnessed the verdant Mount June Island instantly turn into a purgatory on earth with lava flowing everywhere. His 7 apertures were shaken to the point of bleeding. Even though he was under the protection of Li Yunxin as an emptiness realm cultivator, his bones were still creaking. It was so painful that it seemed like they would all break in the next moment. He was at a loss, as if he didn't know what to do at all. Because he saw that even Li Yunxin, who had revealed his fiend god body, had golden blood seeping out of his steel-like scales. The blood converged into a small stream between the scales and gurgled to the ground. As soon as it touched the ground, it burned and emitted green smoke. Li Yunqing was already like this. What else could he do to help? The strong light made him almost unable to open his eyes, and the huge roar almost deafened him. Even in such an environment he could barely hear Li Yunqing talking to him. I was right. Li Yunqing's tone was unexpectedly calm, as if the heavenly thunder was just a gentle breeze and drizzle to him. He continued to use his supernatural power to transmit his voice into Lao Dao's ears. Yesterday I said that someone broke my supreme indifference, and today someone made such a big scene. I was right. Hehe. But no matter who it is, at least I have a knot in my heart. I don't need to bother to guess whether I'm delusional or not. He grinned and looked up at the sky, but he could see nothing except the dazzling white light. Or rather, he could only see the layers of prohibition that he had activated, which were getting dimmer and dimmer under the continuous strikes of the heavenly thunder. Hearing his words, Lao Dao was even more anxious and hateful in his heart. He wished he could bang his head against the wall and die at once. He didn't care whether Li Yunqing could hear him or not. He beat his chest and stamped his feet, shouting, "It was I who harmed you. If I believed your words last night and you were still awake, you wouldn't be trapped here, wouldn't you not know when they came?" But Li Yunqing smiled grimly. If this is also part of that person's plan, everything is interlinked. You didn't ask me to sleep last night, so there must be something else. In his plan, what's the big deal about such a small mistake? They will come sooner or later. I'm glad I came from Mount June. Now listen carefully, I can't hold on any longer. Lao Dao wanted to say something again. But Li Yunqing's tone became a little anxious. So I have to go. But once I leave, you should know that it's not the time for me to go to Dongting Pitfall Mountain or Rong City anymore. I don't know if we can meet again in this life after I leave. Hearing his words, Lao Dao was anxious and sad. The pain in his body was unbearable and he choked for a moment. What are you talking about? But Li Yunqing didn't even want to say a word of nonsense. You have to understand. Since I came to the city of Wei until yesterday, although I was in danger from time to time, I always turned misfortune into fortune. Now I think, it's because others didn't know me well enough and didn't deal with me seriously, so I could pretend to be weak to eat the strong. Now, after so many things have happened, they probably think that they have already figured out my methods and trump cards, so they first broke my oblivion, and then they really started to make a move. The previous days were dull and boring. That was the calm before the storm. And I have thought about this day for a long time, so I tried to prepare for it, but it was too late. Yesterday I knew about the art saint, so I knew this day was approaching. Now after I leave, I need you to do a few things. I don't know if I'll be lucky or not. If you do these things well, maybe I still have a chance to survive. At this moment, listening to Li Yunqing's farewell words, which were completely different from his usual confident tone, Lao Dao had already realized that things were not good. Therefore tears ran down his face. How could he say anything? He could only nod repeatedly. Then he heard Li Yunqing say, "After I leave, if you can survive, you can tell the person that you turned against me long ago. Maybe you can survive. You can hypnotize me last night, I believe you. Then if you can still be free, go to Rong City. Someone will come to ask you to assist Prince Rong. If you can do it, I want you to do everything you can to make things big. It's best if that Prince Rong succeeds." When he said this, the golden blood on his body flowed more rapidly. The armor plates on his arms shattered piece by piece, producing a continuous sound like popping beans. And the momentum of the divine thunder in the sky gradually weakened. This seemed to be a reasonable thing to do. Such a violent and fierce force. A force that 2 octatic treasures ancient scrolls could not withstand. If it could continue to strike for a while, who in the world would be a match for it? Li Yunqing was already an arrow at the end of its flight, and the divine thunder was also an arrow at the end of its flight. Therefore he struggled to hold on until the lightning in the sky gradually disappeared, leaving only a particularly thick purple lightning bolt that struck down. Only then did he shout loudly, "Live!" The lightning bolt hit his body. With a boom, Li Yunqing disappeared in a flash of golden light. A tearing bamboo fracture fan with green smoke was hit in the air and fell to the ground with a clatter. And Lu Laodao also fell to the ground because of this last earth-shaking bang. Up in the sky, the whirlpool of dark clouds gradually dispersed, revealing a dense crowd of cultivators, nearly 100 of them. These practitioners did not seem to come from the same school, but were divided into 3 groups. Although the color and details of their clothes were slightly different, the style was very similar. This style was also similar to the Taoist priests of the Xianxia Danding sect and the Lingshu sword sect who were stationed in the city of Wei. This meant that these 3 groups of people came from the 72 schools of Daotong and Kenzhou. Right now, these 3 groups of people seemed to be stunned, staring at the Mount June island that had turned into a sea of fire, and the fog and huge waves that spread for nearly 100 miles around the island. They did not speak for a long time. They were not looking at the surviving Lu Laodao. But, isn't Li Yunxin in the true realm? The speaker stood in front of a group of disciples of the Xianxia Danding sect, stepping on a dipper, which was made by cutting a gourd in half and drying it in the sun. However, this dipper was neither made of metal nor wood, and it was extremely huge. Behind him, there were more than 20 disciples standing on the flying magic treasure. At this moment, when the sect master of the high-clarity pill cauldron sect moved, the magic treasure beneath his feet moved as well. Therefore the group of disciples staggered left and right. There were even some who cried out as though they were afraid of falling. This meant that many of them had not reached the transcendent realm and could not fly in the sky. Didn't you say that your 9 heavens godly thunder could kill cultivators below the profound realm? Didn't you use your full strength just now? The speaker stood in front of a group of disciples of the Lingshu sword sect. There were also dozens of disciples behind him. There were a dozen or so people riding on flying swords, barely managing to stabilize themselves in the high winds. The remaining 20 stood on a big treasure sword. This big treasure sword was obviously this master's flying Dharma treasure. It was surrounded by a green light and 2 ancient runes were carved on it. One was Xin, and the other was Scholar. The group in the middle was the group that the 2 sect leaders were questioning in disbelief. The leader of this group had a gloomy expression and he frowned. He was holding a small dark cloud in his hand. If this dark cloud was enlarged, it would look like the huge cloud that had just bombarded Mount June with countless terrifying lightning bolts. Chapter 336. This magic treasure is known as the 9 heavens godly thunder. How can it be fake? The head of the 9 heavens godly thunder sect was silent for a while, then suddenly said, "Now that the result is like this," he paused again, "I want to ask you, who is this Li Yunxin that he can actually resist my 9 heavens godly thunder for 6 whole breaths of time?" The head of the pill cauldron sect, a perfected master cultivator, Gui Yunzi, sneered, "You're asking us now? When the 2 sages announced the decree, didn't you say that Li Yunxin is just a true realm demon? What is there to be afraid of? You also said in front of all the cultivators that the people of Langya Cave couldn't do anything to him because they underestimated him. You also said that with the power of our 3 sects working together to activate your magic treasure, the 9 heavens godly thunder, we would definitely be able to kill him in one blow. Do you remember all of that now?" Thus, the head of the 9 heavens godly thunder sect, a perfected master cultivator, Qing Kongzi, frowned again. "Why did you mention those words? The current Daotong Kenzhou is in a state of disunity, and the 2 sages don't care much about it. The reason I said that was because I thought that it was rare for such an arrogant demon to appear. Finally, we fellow cultivators can work together. I also saw that they weren't very enthusiastic about this matter, so I said those words to fit the situation. Why are you so angry now?" They only talked for a few breaths of time. In fact, they were talking as they descended to the ground. In addition to the head of the pill cauldron sect and the head of the 9 heavens godly thunder sect, the head of the Ling Su sword sect, Ming Zhenzi, was also in the true realm. However, these 3 high cultivators could travel 1,000 miles in a breath, but the disciples standing on their magic treasures couldn't. Thus, they could only slowly descend. At least they didn't cause non-combat casualties. Seeing that on the half-melted June mountain the figure of Lu Laodao, who was lying on the only intact piece of land, could be clearly seen, Ming Zhenzi of the Ling Shao sword sect sighed. "Forget it. You 2 don't argue. Li Yunxin was a fiendish demon. He must have used the palace to escape. We also know that the back door of his summer palace is around Dongting. Now we send out the useful disciples and we will stay in Mount June. No matter how powerful he is, he will be seriously injured if his body is able to withstand the divine lightning of the 9th heaven. Once we discover his whereabouts, the 3 of us can kill him together. Do you think he can escape?" "It's best if you can't escape." The head of the Xianxia Danding sect snorts coldly. Our 3 sects are the closest to Dongting, so we have the upper hand. If we let him run far away while wounded, right now all the schools and sects in the world want to kill him. If someone else takes the prize, we won't be able to get the magical treasures from the 2 saints. With that said, the 3 true state sect masters each ordered their disciples who had reached the transcendent state and could fly in the air to search for Li Yunxin's whereabouts. As for the 3 of them, they left the magic treasures and their disciples in the air and landed on the stone pillars in the lava sea of Mount June. As far as they know, the person on the stone pillar is the most valued evil cultivator of Li Yunxin. Now that Li Yunxin left him and escaped, it can be seen that he is really seriously injured. This person must know many secrets of Li Yunxin. The 3 heads don't want their disciples to know those secrets. When it lands on the ground, it immediately feels amazing heat. Now this stone pillar is several meters high out of the lava, but the ground still begins to be scorched black. Some scattered objects on it, such as wood chips, dead branches and pieces of cloth, all begin to emit smoke slowly as if they will burn in the next moment. There are also some other things. Ming Zhenzi glances at the ground and immediately sees the broken bamboo fracture fan. The bamboo ribs of the fan are also smoking and slowly become scorched black. However, the painting on the surface of the fan is undamaged. It is obvious that it is a treasure. Thereupon, the head of the Ling Su sword sect stretched out his finger, and the fan flew into his hand. He frowns slightly and caresses the surface of the fan for a while. Then he raises his head and looks at the other 2. This extraordinary object must be Li Yunxin's temporary imperial residence. He really did use the temporary imperial residence to escape. Then, with a flip of his hand, he puts the fan into his sleeve. The other 2 are knowledgeable. How can they not know that the fan is also a treasure? Just as they are about to speak, they hear Lu Laodao groan softly on the ground, as if he is about to wake up. If an ordinary person were to lie on the ground for a while, their skin and flesh would have been scorched. However, Lu Laodao is an emptiness realm Taoist priest, and his body is much stronger than that of an ordinary person. Therefore, although he was seriously injured and on the verge of death, he still regains some consciousness. He groans again and slowly opens his eyes. The dark clouds that covered the sky and the sun have dispersed. The dazzling white light and the loud rumbling sound have also disappeared. Lao Dao's blurry vision first sees the dazzling sky and the 3 figures above. 3 cultivators wearing tall hats and wide belts are standing next to him, looking down at him from above. When his vision becomes a little clearer, he sees the expressions of the 3 people. They are expressionless. They look at him as if they are looking at an ant. Then he sees one of the cultivators move his lips as if he is saying something, but his eardrums were shattered by the last loud sound, and he is now deaf. Thereupon Lu Laodao clenches his teeth and props himself up to sit up, panting for a while. This action seems to surprise the 3 cultivators. Such a small evil cultivator who is already at the end of the road. Under the pressure of the 3 of them, he is actually able to sit and breathe as if there is no one else around him. Does he not know that he is already at death's door? But this is not the most surprising thing. After this, Lao Dao breathes heavily and coughs out a few mouthfuls of black blood. He slowly regains some strength and unexpectedly opens his mouth. His voice is hoarse, as if his throat is blocked by filthy blood or pieces of internal organs, and he can only squeeze out a hissing sound like a leaking bag. Save me. The 3 sect leaders look at each other, thinking that this person has reached the end of the road and has gone crazy. But then they see that Lao Dao then rolls his eyes. Sooner or later, save me, and ask, why waste time? The sect leader of the High Heaven Sword sect, Ming Zhenzi, is silent for a while, then suddenly smiles and points at Lao Dao on the ground, saying to the other 2 sect leaders, "This person is interesting." But the other 2 obviously do not have the same leisure mood as him. They both frown. The sect leader of the Pill Cauldron sect, Gui Yunzi, coldly snorts. In order to survive, he is just staking it all on one throw. This kind of courage, even animals have it. But although he said that, he still reaches into his sleeve and takes out a golden yellow bud pill. This thing is a treasure for low-level cultivators. Consuming it can prolong one's life, strengthen one's body and raise one's cultivation. But for this Taoist master who is proficient in the Tao of pills, this kind of little thing seems to be something that can be casually used. And so he casually sprinkles it. He exerts force with his fingers, crushing the pill. Then he flips his palm and with a bang the scattered powder is hit through the air into Lao Dao's body. This force makes him spit out a large mouthful of black blood, but his whole person seems to be much more spirited. After another 2 breaths of time, Lao Dao blinks, looking at himself with a slightly surprised expression. Then he pretends to stand up. It seems that he has already recovered. But just as he stands up, the sect leader of the 9 Heavens Divine Thunder sect, Qing Kongzi, shouts like thunder, "Heretic, kneel and talk." Words are law. This shout naturally contains the unique technique of the Divine Thunder sect. The rolling sound waves hit Lao Dao's body, causing him to kneel again with a thud, knocking the ground to crack. But what surprised them was that Lao Dao's expression still doesn't change. After being shouted at to kneel, he calmly kneels. How can an ordinary cultivator endure such extraordinary shame and humiliation? But the 3 sect leaders don't know the sufferings of the human world. This Lu Gongzan Lu Lao Dao in his early years first became a bandit, then made a living in the marketplace. The fickleness of human nature, what kind of humiliation hasn't he endured? Right now this so-called humiliation is really just like a cool breeze to him. He kneels, so he kneels. He even laughed. This master has misunderstood. There are many heretic demons in the world. But I, Lu Gongzan, am not some heretic demon. Hearing him speak, Ming Zhenzi felt that this person is more and more surprising, and for a moment a bit of interest was born. His personality was more easygoing than the other 2 sect leaders, so he said, You have some guts, evil Taoist. Aren't you Li Yunxin's most valued lackey? What are you trying to say now? Lu Lao Dao wiped his face. Then she looked up at him. Li Yunxin, that is the true evil and heretical path. Ming Zhenzi was slightly stunned, then laughed. Oh, this kind of trick. It's not a trick. Lu Lao Dao straightened his back and said solemnly that Li Yunxin had just used his dragon palace to escape and told me to feign civility with the 3 Sendo in exchange for a way out. And he told me that if I could live, I should help him do something so that he could live too. Pooh. He spat on the ground. It's been 4 months and now I've finally escaped from his clutches. The 3 exchanged glances, but none of them believed him. Ming Zhenzi laughed again and said teasingly, Oh? So you're the one feigning civility with him? But wasn't he the one who gave you all of your Dao techniques and cultivation? I heard that the fiendish demon Li Yunxin treated you quite well. Lu Gongzan laughed without any fear on his face. This cultivation base of the Dao? I'll let the 3 Sendo know that I, Lu Gongzan, used to learn some unorthodox methods. In the eyes of the Sendo they are shallow and unorthodox methods. But even so, I have no treasured land, no medicinal pills, no teacher, and I have to run around the streets to make a living. But I still reached the state of conception. How is my aptitude? That Li Yunxin seized my Dragon King temple and gave me some water cloud force. I've only reached the emptiness realm, but when did he ever give me any pointers? He's a heartless man. He thought he gave me a lot of benefits, but he never thought about how I did it. At this point, Lu Gongzan turned his head and glanced at the magma sea below the stone pillar. He suddenly fell silent for a moment. He suddenly turned his head and pointed downwards. Do the 3 Sendo know what's there? My cultivation companion is there. The Taoist nun Shirquizi who used to live in the mountain god temple of Nanshan. At this point Lao Dao's eyes turned red and he gritted his teeth. That Li Yunxin. Who doesn't use him? In the city of Wei, he used my cultivation companion's clone to set up a trap and tricked Taoist Yunzi. At that time I felt a chill in my heart, thinking that one day he might really do that kind of thing. Sure enough. When the city of Wei was breached, my cultivation companion was seriously injured and fell into a coma. She was about to die. He. At this point Lao Dao choked with sobs. He used to draw a body for a lonely soul. He had the ability to make that soul possess a body. At the very least he could put the soul into his dragon palace. At least his soul wouldn't be taken away and scattered. But he only told me that his previous method of drawing a body was not good. He wanted to solve this problem after he figured out a better method. Lao Dao, I'm not knowledgeable, but I'm not stupid. How could I not know that he doesn't trust anyone? Lu Lao Dao took a deep breath and narrowed his eyes. He doesn't trust me either. I know many secrets of his, so he used my cultivation companion to threaten me. He knows that as long as she doesn't come back to life, I have to be loyal to him. Hey, how about now? Her body is gone and her soul is scattered. If it weren't for him, sure Queasy would still be meditating in the Taoist temple. If it weren't for him, Lao Dao, I would still be safe and sound in the city of Wei. How many of my friends and acquaintances are there? Because he first attracted the demons and then attracted the murderous Taoist. They are all destroyed. At this point, Ming Zhenzi no longer smiled but slightly frowned. None of these things seemed to be fake. The three of them all knew a lot about Li Yunxin. Their information came from the two sages and the information from the two sages. The two sages were omnipotent, so it was not strange that they knew these inside stories. Gui Yuanzi sneered and said, he said these things just for. However, the words of the headmaster were interrupted by Lao Dao. Li Yunxin hasn't escaped far now. He is near Dongting. Sendo, if you send people to search carefully, you will definitely find his trace. He also has two treasures with him. I heard that they are two legendary octave ancient scrolls, but he refused to show them to me. A few days ago, the adopted daughter of the Golden Rock King came to Dongting to get the dragon soul, but she took away the only daughter of the Lord Dongting. Bai Yunxin is quite affectionate to Li Yunxin. Sendo, you should also be wary of him seeking refuge with the Golden Rock King. And Li Yunxin's folding fan. Lao Dao looked around as he said this, as if he was looking for something. This time Gui Yuanzi didn't say anything. After a little hesitation, he turned his hand and took out the fan from his sleeve, saying in a low voice, "Are you looking for this?" Lao Dao turned his head and stared at that thing. Yes. This fan is a Ryatsu. This thing has another function. If the Sendo brought a painting Taoist in the true state, as long as the Taoist Wakan was poured into the painting, the situation around Dongting will be clear at a glance. Li Yunxin will have nowhere to escape. When he said the last few words, he gnashed his teeth, but at this moment the three headmasters were really silent. This Taoist priest actually told them such a secret that they didn't know about. Could it be that what he said before was true? Chapter 337. However, they didn't have Taoist painting priest on this trip. There was a true realm Taoist painting priest in the grotto heaven. However, that guy was being watched closely, so how could they invite him? Even so, looking at Lao Dao's actions, they finally had some doubts in their hearts. Lao Dao claimed that he was only staying by Li Yunxin's side to survive. This made sense. He also said that Li Yunxin didn't treat him well and even used his Dao companion to threaten him. This also made sense. In reality, everything he said so far was reasonable. It didn't matter if they believed it or not. And the three sect leaders also knew that words were sometimes the most useless thing to say. For example, Lu Lao Dao had said a lot at this moment. If he was really being coerced and was of no use to them, then what was the point of keeping him alive? If what he said was against his will to save his life, but under such a situation if it was still of some use, then what was the difference from telling the truth? Thus, the three of them exchanged glances. Ming Zhenzi said, "What you said sounds like the truth. In reality, it's of no use. Since he can survive the heavenly tribulation, maybe he isn't fated to die. I'll give you a chance." Lu Lao Dao didn't hesitate and said, "The three demon generals under Li Yunxin are currently at Baijin Ferry, 200 miles upstream of the Wei River. The day before yesterday they came to me to report some news. Right now they are recruiting troops for Li Yunxin. If the three Sendo send people to Baijin Ferry, they will definitely be captured in one fell swoop." Ming Zhenzi was slightly stunned and then smiled. "No wonder that demon Li Yunxin thinks highly of you. Now that I look at you, I know that you are a clever person. Talking to you is effortless." 200 miles? Lu Lao Dao nodded. Ming Zhenzi looked at Gui Yuanzi and Qing Kongzi. "Who will go?" Qing Kongzi raised an eyebrow. "I'll just use my lightning escape to make a trip." Ming Zhenzi nodded. "Thank you." Before his voice could fade away, Qing Kongzi's figure suddenly turned into a thin purple lightning and shot straight into the sky. 4 mortals in the secular world, a distance of 200 li could be covered in a few days. However, to Qing Kongzi, it only took him a few breaths' time to transform into purple lightning and escape. Whether Lu Lao Dao was telling the truth or not, they would know in a quarter of an hour. At that time he could decide his life and death. But it was not even a quarter of an hour. 2 breaths after Qing Kongzi fled, a loud sound suddenly came from the west. A brilliant firework rose high into the sky and exploded. That was the warning signal from the high clear pill cauldron sect's disciple. Ming Jinzi and Gui Yunzi suddenly turned their heads and stared at Lu Laodao. Qing Kongzi just fled to catch the demon general in his mouth, and Li Yunqin appeared here. This old thing was luring the tiger away from the mountain. The oppressive eyes of the two masters in the state of truth made Lu Gongzan's figure shrink, as if it was difficult for him to even breathe. However, he still showed no fear on his face. He just turned his head and looked to the west. In the west was the vast Dongting swamp. The light of the water reached the sky and stretched as far as the eye could see. Right now, these three people could see that on the surface of the lake in the west, a body as thick as a middle finger flashed on the surface of the water and quickly dived into the water. However, the surging waves surged in all directions. The disciple on the surface of the lake who gave the warning was like a speck of dust, almost swept into the water by the monstrous waves. Such a long distance. The body was still as thick as a finger. Could be seen how huge that thing was. If it wasn't the real body of Li Yunqin, what else could it be? However, after a glance, Lu Laodao shouted, "Two sendos, don't be fooled. That is not the real body of Li Yunqin or some huge water monster in the lake." How could they listen to his nonsense? Ming Jinzi and Gui Yuanzi snorted coldly. They rose to the sky and went straight to the place of the warning. The two of them flew close to the surface of the lake. The surging airwaves blasted a long trail on the surface of the water, as if there were two fast big fish under the water. Ming Jinzi pinched his fingers and patted the back of his head. Immediately, a green flying sword was spat out from his mouth. This flying sword grew with the wind, emitting a brilliant light that couldn't be looked at directly. It was like a small sun appeared on the surface of the lake out of nowhere. It made the sky dim. As soon as Ming Jinzi released his flying sword, Gui Yuanzi beside him raised his hand and shot a soybean-sized, black pellet at the place where the dragon just appeared. Then they saw a strange scene on the lake. It was a soybean-sized pellet, but even the splashing water was much bigger than it. But once it entered the water, the originally dark green surface of the lake suddenly turned pitch black. It was not just a small piece, but a vast expanse of black that was beyond their sight. It was like a god pouring dye directly into Dongting from the sky. He even ignored the process of diffusion. As soon as the lake turned black, it immediately boiled. This boiling was not because of anything else, but because hundreds of millions of fish and shrimps in the lake died in an instant and rushed to the surface of the water at the same time. One breath ago the lake was still green, but then it turned black in an instant. After another breath, even the blackness disappeared. The dense corpses of fish and shrimps piled up layer after layer on the surface of the water in an instant. In the end, Dongting Lake disappeared as far as the eye could see. There was only a land formed by the corpses of fish and shrimps with an amazing stench. Then a furious roar suddenly erupted from beneath the continent. This roar was like thunder and also like the howl of a bull. Was it not a dragon roar? The corpses of fish and shrimps where the roar came from surged. It seemed that there was a giant beast struggling in the water in pain. Ming Jinzi looked away and shouted, "Go!" Boom, 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 boom. A series of huge cone-shaped clouds exploded in front of them. The dazzling flying sword shot into the water like a bright electric light. Hundreds of millions of tons of poisonous water and rotten corpses were blasted into the sky by the power of this sword. A flower of death that could be recognized by the naked eye from hundreds of miles away bloomed in Dongting Lake. Just this blow, Dongting, which was hundreds of meters deep, was blasted to the bottom. A huge pit was blasted in the lake for a short time, and the lake water on the four walls didn't even have time to pour down to fill it. So at the bottom of the pit a huge dragon body was nailed into the mud by Ming Jinzi's flying sword. Its head was directly penetrated and most of it was gone. It was a head as big as a big house with one eye. Its body was still twitching, which was a dying struggle. Every time it twitched, thousands of tons of mud were swept into the sky. It was killed by Ming Jinzi with a sword. But the question was it so easy? The black water and corpses roared and filled the pit again. It took more than 10 breaths. The surging airwaves and water vapor spread dozens of miles away with a loud noise. Those disciples with weaker cultivation who gathered here didn't dare to get close at all. Once one was sucked into it, they would immediately perish and their souls would be destroyed. However, Ming Jinzi and Gui Yunzi stopped in the boundless black fog and looked at each other. Because they both saw that there were no scales on the dead body. It was actually something similar to a dragon's body but actually had spots. and on the remaining half of its head, the two horns couldn't be seen. But the most important point about the description of Li Yunxin's real body was that it had 2 red horns on its head and a silver-white mane. The 2 perfected immortals were stunned for a moment and realized that before they attacked, Lao Dao said that was not Li Yunxin's real body, was actually true. And only then did Ming Zhenzi feel a little lucky. He just wanted to crush Lao Dao to death with one finger. But thinking that there might be some unknown secrets on his body, he hesitated for a moment. Now it seemed that it was a wise move. Guiyuanzi sighed slightly and waved his hand. So the black fog and black water that filled the sky instantly faded, and a black pill condensed in his hand again. Just like when it spread out, there was no process. I don't know where this water monster came from. Guiyuanzi put the pill in his palm and said, "We can only look at the disciples who are searching around nearby." Halfway through his sentence he suddenly paused and furrowed his eyebrows. They had originally left the magic treasure that carried the disciples who couldn't fly in the sky above the stone pillar. And at this moment, the ones who rushed to Dongting Lake with them were the disciples with higher cultivation levels. These magic treasures were all treasures that they had refined with their natal fire, so they had a natural connection with their masters. Although they were dozens of miles away, they could still control them as if they were their own arms, and their thoughts were not slow at all. But at this moment the two suddenly felt that the magic treasure was actually under a strong and fierce attack. Li Yunxin. The two masters shouted this name at the same time. Without any hesitation they turned around and rushed toward Mount June again. But the power of Ming Zhenzi's overbearing attack was really too great. The surging water mist covered the square garden for several miles. When the two finally broke through the thick fog and arrived high in the sky, they found that there were dozens of disciples who had flown in from all directions, but not a single one of them was left. Some of the magic treasures that flew in the sky were given to these disciples by them. The disciples' cultivation levels weren't high enough, so they hadn't completely refined it. Therefore, once the user died, the magic treasure would wander around for a while like a loyal dog that had lost its master. Since the High Heaven Sword sect cultivated the sword Dao, most of the magic treasures they used were flying swords. Before this trip, Ming Zhenzi specially gave 5 of his outstanding disciples 5 water-repelling light-splitting swords. At this moment he took a closer look. The 5 flying swords were still leisurely spinning in the air. And on each flying sword, half of their bodies were standing straight. When they saw it they spat out blood and fell down from the clouds. This meant that these disciples had actually been killed by Li Yunxin in an instant 2 breaths ago, right next to the 2 sect masters. Her methods were swift and vicious, and she didn't even stop. She didn't even put away her magic treasures. Li Yunxin. Ming Zhenzi shouted again. But the last time he shouted this name it was because he was shocked. But this time he shouted this name it was because he was shocked and angry. The disciples who cultivated to the state of the transcendent were not cabbages in the vegetable garden. Now that the sect's disciples who were at the state of the transcendent were almost all killed in a single encounter, how could he not be shocked and angry? There was nothing more to say. The 2 supreme leaders pounced ferociously towards the bright red Mount June in the distance with hatred in their hearts. They broke through the air as they made the magic gesture to retrieve their magic weapons. The disciples in the place of the outer fringe were all dead. If those disciples who were left on Mount June were to die as well, then they would truly be alone. But who would have thought that Li Yunxin was obviously seriously injured and should have only wanted to escape. But now he actually had the guts to come back. This demon was simply a lunatic. But when they made the hand signs their hearts sank again. They didn't listen to their orders anymore. This meant that their magic treasures were seriously injured. The flow of spiritual energy was not very smooth. But that Li Yunxin clearly just arrived at Mount June. What did he use to destroy these 2 treasures? At this time the 2 were already close to Mount June. They could see the appearance of the bright red mountain peak clearly. Sure enough, there was a powerful fiend celestial shrouded in faint golden mist fighting with dozens of disciples who were controlling magic treasures to dodge left and right. And this demon god had a pair of blood-red antlers on his head that rose to the sky, snow-white mane on his neck stood up, and his body was covered with pale green scales. Who else could it be but that Wei River Dragon King Li Yunxin? With just a glance, the disciples on the magic treasures fell down one after another like dumplings. Once they fell into the sea of lava, they didn't even leave a wisp of smoke, immediately disappearing without a trace. Looking at that Li Yunqin again, he held a golden treasure in his hand which looked like a small sword but also like a dagger. He used the demon energy on his body to force out an ordinary aura. Without the slightest bit of reason or technique, he just blindly slashed at the two magic treasures, one sword and the other magic treasures. The moment the black light that the disciples barely managed to activate came into contact with the sword aura he forced out, it was immediately smashed. Then, it fiercely hit the three magic treasures, causing another wave of heart-wrenching buzzing sound. Ming Zhenzi was so anxious that his eyes turned red. He shouted from afar, "Evil creature, don't run, eat my sword." He spat out his dazzling flying sword. But just as this sword was about 10 feet away from his body, Ming Zhenzi hastily stopped its momentum. This flying sword was called Cave Knight. It was extremely powerful and its sword nature was fierce and unyielding. If he used this attack again, not to mention whether or not he could kill Li Yunqin, those disciples definitely wouldn't be able to live. Thus he hesitated for a moment. It was also at this moment that he saw from afar that Li Yunqin took advantage of the moment when the three magic treasures were temporarily forced away to throw something down, and then he shouted, "Come up." This shout didn't seem to be directed at them, nor at the disciples on the three magic treasures. It should be directed at Lu Lao Dao on the stone pillar. So this demon had killed his way back just to save that Taoist. But the strange thing was that Lao Dao actually just stood on the stone pillar, raised his head and shouted a few curses but didn't follow him. Li Yunqin seemed to be stunned, his body actually stopped in midair. Those low-level disciples took advantage of this opportunity and once again rode on their magic treasures, charging forward without fear of death. Three beams of black light converged and in one breath he was sent flying more than 10 feet away. At this moment the two sect leaders finally arrived. Ming Zhenzi and Gui Yuanzi raised their hands and each threw out dozens of small swords and pills, which went straight towards Li Yunqin. This way River Dragon King finally came back to his senses. He turned his head back and fiercely glared at Ming Zhenzi and Gui Yuanzi from a distance of several tens of feet. He stretched out his hand and pointed at them from afar, and the corners of his eyes seemed to be about to split open. "This debt none of you can escape." After he finished speaking, a gust of sinister and terrifying demon wind suddenly rose in midair, carrying with it thick dark clouds, whimpering and sweeping across a large area. In this wind and clouds, Li Yunqin revealed his dragon body that was 100 feet long. Thunder and lightning crackled, the violent demonic power overflowed in all directions, and the small swords and pills that were attacking were swept away in all directions with crackling sounds. With another violent long cry and a wave of his tail, the remaining dozens of disciples on the three magic treasures were all swept into the magma by him. Then this Qi Wen no longer looked at Lu Lao Dao on the stone pillar, whistling straight towards the east. Everything happened in 3 breaths. When Ming Zhenzi and Gui Yuanzi finally arrived above the stone pillar and took back their respective magic treasures, their sect's disciples, including the disciples under the sect leader of the 9 Heavens Divine Thunder sect, Chen Kongzi, were all killed. Li Yunqin, I will definitely cut you into 1,000 pieces. Ming Zhenzi roared towards the sky. The depression in his chest almost made him spit out a mouthful of blood. Originally, it was the 3 sects that joined forces to attack this demon and heavily injured him. But now not only did he escape, but he also killed all the disciples under him. Since the establishment of their sect for thousands of years, when had they ever suffered such a tragic loss? But they couldn't catch up. Qi Wen was originally a dragon. He could fly on the clouds and the mist. Flying in the air was almost an innate ability of dragons, not to mention activating demon power with a 1,000 feet long dragon body. Hatefully, that cunning Li Yunqin came back, to save Lao Dao, and also to destroy their magic treasures. Without these 2 magic treasures, how could they chase after Long Sun? Qin Kongzi even went to Bai Jingdu. But even if he came back, did he dare to chase alone? If he had the confidence to kill this demon alone, why did he gather the power of the 3 sects to attack him with divine thunder, instead of rushing straight into the school of the Emperor Star to capture him? Ming Zhenzi was filled with hatred and Gui Yuanzi was filled with even more hatred. The encounter just now was the first time they saw what Li Yunqin looked like, but the crazy and violent aura of the demon had already been deeply imprinted in their hearts. They knew that this was indeed not an ordinary big demon who occupied land and ruled as a king. Since he couldn't catch up and didn't dare to, he looked down at Lu Laodao. With nowhere to vent his anger, he suddenly stretched out his hand and pulled Laodao up out of thin air. With a little strength in his palm, he pinched him until his face turned purple, and he could only spit out air like a fish out of water. What did that demon say to you just now? What did you say to him? Is this your evil plan? Chapter 338. Lao Dao's neck is in his palm. How can he speak? He reaches out to break Gui Yuanzi's fingers, but he can't move them. Seeing him struggling for a while, his face has turned purple, and his movements are getting weaker and weaker. Ming Zhenzi, who is looking at him coldly, says, "Let him go first. Listen to what he has to say." Gui Yuanzi grits his teeth. What else is there to say? He must be a spy. Ming Zhenzi sighs. Duanfang, don't forget, he told us before. That is not the real body of Li Yunxin. Gui Yuanzi is slightly stunned and turns to look at Ming Zhenzi in surprise. He calls himself Duanfang. Duanfang is his courtesy name. In fact, the headmasters of Lingshu Sword School and Danding School of Xianxia are rare best friends in Daotong and Kenzhou. They call each other by their courtesy names in private to show their closeness. Now Ming Zhenzi calls him like this. Gui Yuanzi can only frown slightly. Do you really believe him? Listen to him. Ming Zhenzi waves his hand. Lu Laodao gets rid of Gui Yuanzi's palm and is taken to the front of the headmaster of Lingshu Kenzhou. I did say. Laodao gasps a few times as if he is suffocating and squeezes out the sentence. He seems to be not used to standing in the nothingness. He is in a flurry and looks a little embarrassed. However, there is no fear on his face. Instead, he is a little proud and satisfied. After saying this, he reaches out and points to the lake. In the past, the dragon's soul stayed in Dongting. Every year it would give birth to 1 or 2 evil flood dragons and water monsters. The previous one was probably a new water monster a few days ago. However, the 2 Sendo are too impatient. Ming Zhenzi doesn't speak but stares at him carefully. After watching for a while, he asks, "Just now, what did Li Yunxin say to you?" "He came back to save me." Lao Dao shook his head with a pleased look on his face. "How could I enter the tiger's den again? If not for the 2 Sendo's timely return, I would have been taken away by him again." That demon's expression at that time. Haha, it was really interesting. Gui Yuanzi snorted coldly. Nonsense. However, Ming Zhenzi thought for a moment and nodded slightly. Now, Li Yunxin has brutally killed dozens of my disciples and committed another heinous crime. And you are Li Yunxin's former servant. Is there any reason why I shouldn't kill you? The sect master of the Ling Su sword sect had been furious just a moment ago, but now he had calmed down a lot. This sudden change was a little strange. Thus, Gui Yuanzi finally realized that Ming Zhenzi seemed to really believe that this heretic had something worth paying attention to. But he himself did not think much of it. What good could the heretical ways of the fiendish demons do? However, with this opportunity, Lu Laodao finally heaved a sigh of relief. He smiled slightly. I still have that Li Yunxin's unique secret method. I can tell Sendo about it. Ming Zhenzi raised his eyebrows. Unique secret method. That Li Yunxin cultivates the path of painting. I cultivate the path of swordsmanship. What do I need his secret method for? Lao Dao didn't panic and shook his head lightly. It's not this method. It's Li Yunxin's heart study. This thing. I can't explain it clearly for a moment. This can be considered a secret method created by Li Yunxin himself. He is arrogant, so he named it heart study after himself. Not only can cultivators cultivate it, demons can cultivate it and mortals can also cultivate it. It doesn't need any medicinal pills with aptitude. There must be a difference. It's just that those with good aptitude advance faster while those with poor aptitude advance slower. But as long as you put your heart into it, you will gain something. Gui Yuanzi sneered disdainfully. Even if it's true, since everyone can cultivate it, what good thing can it be? Lu Gongzan turned his face to look at him. The Sendo is looking at me. Could it be that he still hasn't realized? What use does that heart study have? His bold direct gaze and question caused the 2 sect masters to be slightly stunned. But they had already looked at Lu Laodao for a long time and had already examined his body. There wasn't anything special about his body, so what was there to be aware about? Seeing them frown slightly, Lu Laodao smiled. It's already been an hour. An hour ago, the 2 Sendo firmly believed that I was that Li Yunxin's lackey. And at that time I was seriously injured and on the verge of death. Such a heretic, with such a low level of cultivation, actually lived until now under the eyes of Sendo. And during this time the two disciples of Sendo were harmed by Li Yunxin, but I was still alive. Didn't the two of you realize that this matter isn't normal? Ming Zhenzi seriously thought for a while and said, "You should have died long ago." Gui Yuanzi snorted coldly. "But relying on clever words and beauty to survive until now." Lu Laodao still smiled in a neither servile nor overbearing manner. "This is that Li Yunxin's heart study. Even the two Sendo didn't realize what methods I used. But they felt that I should be spared, right? So the two were silent. After a moment of silence, the cold smile on their faces finally disappeared. It's a little interesting." Ming Zhenzi lightly shook his head. "Then how much of his heart study did you learn?" 3 points. But with Sendo's wisdom he can see through a small part of a leopard. This 3 points is enough for Sendo to see through Li Yunxin's tricks in the future. Ming Zhenzi turned to look at Gui Yuanzi. Gui Yuanzi looked at Lu Laodao again and waved his hand. "I'm not interested." Ming Zhenzi then looked at Laodao. "For the time being we'll wait for Sect Master Qing Kongzi to return. If we really capture the demons under Li Yunxin as you said, you can follow me back to Yunshan." Laodao straightened his body in the void and solemnly bowed to Ming Zhenzi. After this bow, a low rumble of thunder suddenly rang out from the west. Then a figure shot over like lightning, setting off a strong wind that almost blew Lu Laodao into the sea of lava. It was Qing Kongzi, the sect master of the Nine Heavens Divine Thunder sect, who went to Baijin Ferry to capture the demon general. He stopped and stared at the surroundings. His voice was like the sound of bells and drums. "Where are my disciples? Where are my treasures?" Gui Yuanzi sighed softly and took out the Dharma treasure that he had left here previously, which carried his disciples, and returned it to him. "That Li Yunxin came here. He showed his dragon form and our magic treasure was destroyed. We couldn't catch up with him, we could only watch him go east." Qing Kongzi suddenly frowned. "You just sat and watched him escape? Huh. Hey. Such extraordinary shame and humiliation. Hey. You guys. I'll go catch him right now." After he said this he turned around and was about to escape again. Gui Yuanzi and Ming Zhenzi knew that he cultivated thunder magic. Although the thunder escape technique couldn't last long, it could move freely within a radius of 1,000 miles like thunder and lightning, far faster than ordinary cultivators. But if he wanted to chase alone, Ming Zhenzi immediately stopped him. "Senior brother, don't be impulsive. Senior brother, did you forget? That Li Yunxin is a fiendish demon. Fiendish demons have stronger fleshly bodies than us human cultivators. Now he is also a dragon, that is a demon among demons. His strength is even more incomparable. And he cultivates Taoist magic. Although the Taoist magic of painting is not mainstream, it is still the divine heart technique that the two sages approved of. Senior brother, think about the Nine Heavens Divine Thunder again. We gathered the power of our 3 sects to activate that magic treasure together. That demon actually used his magic treasure and body to resist it. This kind of strength. Although he is in the true realm, senior brother, if you go alone, I'm afraid you will be in danger. Don't let your guard down against 100-year-old Tao fruit." It would have been better if he didn't say this. Now that Qing Kongzi heard this he was even more furious. "Demon. Why are the two of you so afraid?" Gui Yuanzi sighed. "The disciples of the two of us previously fought with that Li Yunxin. Bah." Qing Kongzi had already turned hostile due to anger. Without saying anything more he rode on lightning and disappeared into the horizon with a hum. But after Qing Kongzi escaped, these two sect masters actually didn't move. They looked at each other and were silent for a while. Then Ming Zhenzi said, "He can't get over it. Why bother?" Gui Yuanzi smiled slightly mockingly. "If you didn't say those words just now he wouldn't have taken it so hard. But, indeed, why bother? Right now, all the Kenzo sects and grotto heavens of the world want to find that Li Yunxin. If he risked his life to chase after him, even if he risked his life he could seriously injure Li Yunxin. If Li Yunxin escaped from our 3 sects' territory, wouldn't it be like making a wedding dress for someone else?" The two of them spoke as if there was no one else around. Lu Laodao listened quietly at the side. Hearing this he suddenly clapped his hands. So that's how it is. It had been a very, very long time since someone had the guts to interrupt so rudely when two sect masters were talking. But perhaps because his performance today was too strange and gave these two sect masters too many surprises, he actually wasn't casually slapped to death. Instead, Ming Zhenzi turned to look at him with interest. What do you know? Lao Dao was calm and unruffled in the midst of the chaos. He narrowed his eyes and said slowly, "If I were Lao Dao, I'd say that Sendo just used a psychological method. That's why that Sendo rode on lightning and left. As for why he used such a psychological method, I guess, right now Dao Tong and Kenzo are all under the orders of the two saints to surround and kill that demon Li Yunxin. But Lao Dao once heard Li Yunxin say that the sects of the world are not of one mind. For example, in our Qing kingdom there is the Lingshu sword sect, the Shangqing Danding sect, and now we know there is also the Zhou Xian divine thunder sect. 36 paradises and 72 sections. The masters can be above the common people, but the disciples can't. They will always need some resources. Since they need resources, they will always need to divide the world's power. I think the area around Qing kingdom belongs to your three sections. The reason why the three Sendo used all their strength earlier was presumably to kill Li Yunxin in one blow. What they were most afraid of was the current situation, only seriously injuring him and then letting him escape. If he escapes like this and escapes from your territory, wouldn't that be letting others take advantage of it? Lao Dao thought. The two saints must have promised some treasure for you to be so envious. Ming Zhenzi looked at Gui Yuanzi and smiled. This Taoist has some good eyes. Gui Yuanzi huffed coldly and didn't say anything. But Lu Lao Dao restrained his expression and lowered his voice. Next, it is Lao Dao's theory of condemnation. The two Sendo must first forgive my capital crime before I can speak. Hearing his words, Gui Yuanzi looked at him with surprise. Condemnation theory? He thought again. Forgive your crime. Let's hear it. Lu Lao Dao took a deep breath. Dao Tong and Kenzo's practice is about abandoning emotions and abandoning desires. But the two Sendo call each other by their characters. Presumably their friendship is not shallow. So they plan to use the Jiuxiao Divine Thunder Sect's magic treasure to take down Li Yunxin in one blow with the force of lightning, but they failed. Not only did they fail, but they also suffered heavy losses. Lao Dao, I don't know to what extent the internal strife within the seemingly harmonious Dao Tong and Kenzo has reached, but I know it is certainly not a good thing. Since they lost and knew they couldn't get Li Yunxin, then they had to find some advantages from other places. Then, perhaps this Sendo knew that the person they were chasing just now had a fiery temper, so he purposely said those words. Once they ran into Li Yunxin and the two sides started to fight. If Li Yunxin killed him, the Qing kingdom, which originally belonged to three factions, could now be taken in by two factions? Even if the Jiuxiao Divine Thunder Sect had a new sect leader, they didn't have any disciples. It would be extremely difficult to have the two of you spit out what you ate. Lao Dao, am I speaking the truth? Ming Zhenzi and Gui Yuanzi met each other's eyes. Then Ming Zhenzi smiled. You also deduced these things from your studies of the mind? Lu Lao Dao also smiled. It is nothing more than a strange and obscene skill. But have the two of you Sendo never thought of other things? Other things? For example, being more proactive. Lu Lao Dao lowered his voice again. There are only 3 left. No one saw it. If that Li Yunxin only heavily injured that sect leader, why don't the two of you take the opportunity? Ming Zhenzi furrowed his brows abruptly. How dare you? Lao Dao immediately stopped and spread his hands innocently. Sendo, forgive me. Sendo had previously promised to forgive my sins. Gui Yuanzi laughed coldly and looked at Ming Zhenzi. Do you see? In the end, this evil Taoist is an evil Taoist. His thoughts are unfathomable and he will do anything. Do you really want to keep him alive and keep him by your side? Ming Zhenzi stared coldly at Lao Dao for a while and snorted. Keep him first. Let's see what other tricks he has up his sleeves. But after saying this, he and Gui Yuanzi fell silent for a while. Then, the two of them looked at each other. Qing Kongzi had left for less than a quarter of an hour. If they followed, perhaps they would really be able to catch up. Then they fell silent for a while. Ming Zhenzi opened his mouth. Guanfeng, we should go and take a look together. After all, we are of the same path. Moreover, he looked at Lu Lao Dao. I still haven't asked him if he has obtained that Baijindu demon general. Gui Yuanzi hesitated for a while and also looked at Lu Lao Dao. He nodded without saying a word. The atmosphere seemed a little strange. So the two sect leaders silently folded their sleeves. Lu Laodao was pulled into the sky and sped east with them. Chapter 339. Qing Kongzi, full of anger, chases Li Yunxin with the method of thunder escape. There is no chance for him to catch up with him. This is not a journey for mortals. There are only one or several shortcuts. Dongting is surrounded by boundless wild forests. The towering ancient trees are lush. Besides, Li Yunxin can walk in the sky or in the water. He can even hide in the forest. It is not easy to find him. However, today luck seems to be on the side of the head of the Nine Heavens Divine Thunder School. He rushes more than 500 miles in one breath. Then he shows up in the lightning. He adjusts his Reiki and runs away. At this moment he finds a black spot on the horizon. The great Dongting Lake has been left behind. Now it is a dark green forest under them. The sun hangs high in the sky. The sky is so blue that it looks like water is about to drip out. The sky is blue, the ground is green, and the sun is shining between heaven and earth. Therefore the spot on the horizon is particularly eye-catching. Qing Kongzi's heart jumps. He adjusts his breath for 3 seconds and then grits his teeth to rush away. He is sure that it must be Li Yunxin. After another 3 seconds the figure finally becomes clear. A huge cloud of mist was also moving quickly, and there were occasional flashes of lightning in the cloud like bright white snakes. If you look at it carefully for a long time, you will find that the cloud is not pure white. There seems to be something huge hidden in it which makes it slightly dark. From time to time, faint golden mist would rise from the dark clouds. It was a very beautiful sight. Qing Kongzi knows that the blood of dragons is golden. He is caught up with Li Yunxin. At this moment there is only one number in his mind, 46. He takes 46 disciples with him on this trip. Wu Gongzan is right. Daotong and Kenzo also have a division of influence. However, their division is very different from the schools in Jianghu. Because there is a place called Yunshan in the world. The cloud mountain was suspended high in the sky. It was a floating mountain. The two saints live on Yunshan. Most of the leaders of various caves and schools also live on Yunshan all year round. The cloud mountain was incomparably huge. It was a stone fortress. It extended in all directions and had countless halls. No one seemed to know how many rooms and passageways there were in the cloud mountain, and no one knew how many people the cloud mountain could hold. The population of Cloud Mountain was mainly composed of 3 groups. Apart from the 2 sages, the first group consisted of the sect masters, sect leaders, and the elite disciples who came with them to run errands or stay here for a long time. The second part was the Dao children that were born from the cultivator couples. These Taoists grew up and cultivated on Cloud Mountain. They were close to the core of Daotong and Kenzo, and thus had the most resources and conveniences. Most of the Taoists were assigned to the grotto heavens or sects that their parents belonged to. Only a few of them would change sections. Very few of them belonged to no sect and they were pure Cloud Mountain people. The third group consisted of mortals. Very few mortals were lucky enough to come to Cloud Mountain in the beginning. In fact, it was hard to say if they were lucky or unlucky, because if they could not cultivate they could only stay on Cloud Mountain and serve the immortals for the rest of their lives. Immortals lived long lives and aged slowly. On the other hand, these mortals were like weeds, their time passing by quickly. However, the Great Way was heartless. Who would care about their feelings? In fact, as these mortals slowly multiplied, their numbers became the largest. However, almost no one in the world knew of their existence. The cultivators would not even mention it. It seemed that in the eyes of many cultivators, the existence of mortals on Cloud Mountain, to a certain extent, tarnished the glory of the Xianmen. When the Taoists of Cloud Mountain reached the perfect state, they were faced with a choice. They could either cultivate on Cloud Mountain for the rest of their lives, or they could leave the core of the Xianmen and go to the wild world below. The disciples who chose to stay became part of the sects that were permanently stationed on Cloud Mountain. The disciples who chose to leave had to go elsewhere, to the grotto heavens and the sect's mountain in the secular world. For example, the Zhou Thunder sect's sphere of influence included more than half of the Qin kingdom. Its mountain in the secular world was in the warm south of the Qin kingdom, about 1,000 miles away from Dongting. However, there was a long and towering cloud mountain range between the two. Thus, in the eyes of mortals, the distance was considered far. In the secular world, some knowledgeable and insightful people knew about the celestial mountains and blessed lands, referred to this kind of place. This time, Qing Kongzi of the Jiuxiao Thunder Sect had brought 46 disciples from the secular mountain of the Jiuxiao Thunder Sect located in the Crimson Cloud Mountain, 1,000 miles away. Although these disciples were cultivators raised in the wild world, to Qing Kongzi, they were closer to him than the Taoists who were permanently stationed on Cloud Mountain. He had to stay on Cloud Mountain for 5 or 6 months a year. Firstly, he served and protected the two sages in Cloud Mountain in name. Secondly, the closer he was to the two sages, the more likely he was to get good stuff. In history, it was not as if there had never been a precedent of a sage suddenly passing on some kind of mysterious divine ability to a cultivator by his side. If Li Yunqi knew about the strange relationship between the leaders of the various grotto heavens, the two sages and Cloud Mountain, he would probably say, in fact, it was very similar to the relationship between some kings and lords in the West in his world. The lords all had fiefdoms under their names. However, the lords might not always stay in their fiefdoms. Instead, they would gather in the capital or the king's castle. The nobles, on the other hand, would send their children to the palace to serve the king. To a certain extent, this was also very similar to the Taoists of Cloud Mountain. Therefore, in Qing Kongzi's opinion, the disciples of the Jiuxiao Thunder Sect who stayed on Cloud Mountain, they were all people who didn't experience much in the world. They only knew how to cultivate and were spoiled since childhood. Their parents might be former cultivators of their own sect, or disciples of other sections. The relationship between them was complicated. Compared to the cultivators in the secular mountain, almost all of them were treasures that couldn't be touched. What about the disciples in Crimson Cloud Mountain? Most of them were people from the secular world who obtained immortal fate, and were brought into the sect by him or his disciples to cultivate. They knew how to respect others, how to be grateful, and how to be loyal to himself. Now these 46 cultivators were all killed by Li Yunqi. To Qing Kongzi this was equivalent to cutting off his arms. How could he not hate this? Therefore, as soon as he got closer, he raised his hand and once again took out his treasure, the Jiuxiao Thunder. He shouted, "Demon, where are you going?" As soon as he shouted, the small dark cloud in his hand also increased in size, and actually became as big as his body. In an instant, several electric arcs hissed and struck straight at the cloud in front where Li Yunqi was hiding. Originally, he was prepared to have another hard fight. Who knew that just these several electric arcs would be able to disperse the mountain-like cloud? The thick fog suddenly surged and the entire sky was shrouded by a hazy mist. And the huge figure that was hiding in the cloud disappeared in an instant. Qing Kongzi knew that Li Yunqi must have transformed into a human or a demon, and was hiding in the fog in an attempt to escape. How could he give his opponent this opportunity? He activated the spiritual power in his palm, and the magic treasure, the Jiuxiao Thunder, increased in size again, turning into a ring-shaped dark cloud that surrounded him. Then hundreds of purple electric arcs exploded in all directions with a rumble. The air was filled with thick mist, and this mist helped the electric power. The electric arcs instantly weaved into an electric net, and the electric net extended even further. Finally, a muffled grunt was heard. Found him. Qing Kongzi's brows stood erect. Immediately from his sleeve he sprinkled a sky full of shiny steel beads toward that direction. The steel balls tore a path in the fog like a storm and then exploded with a rumble. Loud noises reverberated in the air. Even those towering ancient trees hundreds of meters below were destroyed by the blast from the sky. Not to mention the clouds in the sky. In an instant they were completely driven away. Finally, that Li Yunqi was revealed. Qing Kongzi's previous thunderous attack seemed to have succeeded. Or maybe he was injured by the thunderstorm on Mount Jun. Li Yunqi revealed his god-devil form. However, the dense scales on his body were now broken, and more than half of his body was covered in something that looked like gold foil. This was probably his blood. The blood of dragons was golden, and when it dried up it looked like gold. These were considered minor injuries, but the serious injury was on his back. From his neck to his waist there was a huge gap. One could even see the dark spine inside. The blood seemed to have dried up. His pale muscles were like hardened plaster, and occasionally some golden stains would seep out. But his spirit seemed to be fine. Li Yunqi didn't stop and continued to fly away. And that Qing Kongzi was also chasing after him. So from the looks of these two people it looked like they had stopped. The heavily injured dragon's son glanced at Qing Kongzi from afar, and let out a hoarse but arrogant laugh. Dao Tong and Kenzo want to deal with me and they sent trash like you? Qing Kongzi kept his mouth shut. He didn't use talismans earlier, and directly used his divine ability, which had already consumed some spiritual energy. And now he was accumulating energy again so that he could use the lightning escape technique to intercept that Li Yunxin. He didn't say anything, so Li Yunxin didn't say anything either. With a flip of his palm he took out a few jade bottles from who knows where. He didn't even have the patience to pull out the cork, and directly used his sharp nails to cut it open. Then he poured the pills inside into his mouth like he was eating candy. The distance between the two wasn't far, so Qing Kongzi could see those jade bottles clearly, and felt that they looked familiar. Thinking again, he understood. Li Yunxin must have stolen them from the Shangqing Danding sect's disciple after he ambushed the disciples of the 3 sections. This meant that Li Yunxin looked arrogant, but in reality he was already an arrow at the end of its flight. First he was struck by the heavenly thunder, and then he ran for hundreds of miles without stopping. Just now he was struck by the purple thunder bead. Right now he couldn't move fast anymore. So he had no choice but to eat those things as he ran, hoping to quickly recover some energy so that he could escape again. Chapter 340. He was overjoyed when he found out about this. He felt the spiritual power in his ocean of qi and mountain of snow surging, so he didn't care about accumulating anymore. He made a sign with his hand, and with a buzz he turned into a bolt of lightning and shot straight towards Li Yunxin. His escape technique was very similar to the shadow shifting technique. One moment he was here and the next moment he appeared behind Li Yunxin. But when he ran out of spiritual energy and reappeared, he found that Li Yunxin had also used all her strength to rush forward for a distance. The two of them had returned to the previous situation. However, the dragon's son was barely holding on, and it seemed to affect his injuries. The long wound on his back was torn open, and a large amount of golden mist splashed in the air. He started to pour pills into his mouth again. However, things like medicinal pills, the body would eventually get sick of using them too much. The pills he had were also limited. How long could he last? That was what Qing Kongzi thought. So he didn't give up. He just stared at him silently and used his technique again, determined not to let him go. But Li Yunxin seemed to be angry. He turned his head as he ran and stared at the sect leader fiercely. I don't have time to deal with you now. You better turn around and go back. When I come back I'll kill you. If you continue to chase me recklessly, I'll send you to see your celestial being. His words were full of vigor. Unfortunately, as soon as he finished speaking, he spat out a mouthful of golden blood and coughed a few times. Qing Kongzi was even more delighted. His eyes turned and he suddenly had a plan. He rolled his sleeves and suddenly took out a small corpse. The corpse had a sharp mouth and a thin tail. It looked like a house mouse. Qing Kongzi sneered amidst the whistling wind. Li Yunxin, take a look at what this is. After that he raised his hand and threw the thing over. But the two of them were as fast as a shooting star. As soon as the little thing left their hands, it was blown to the back by the strong wind. But the eyesight of a cultivator was different from that of a mortal. Even though they were far away, Li Yunxin could still see it clearly. Then his expression changed, but he gritted his teeth and said, You want to scare me with this thing? Qing Kongzi burst into laughter. This thing? Hey. That thing called itself the Green Dragon Emissary and said that his Taoist name was Shuk. When I caught him he tried to hurt me, but I killed him with a casual jolt. After saying this he took out another rabbit corpse and threw it forward. Look, who is this? This time, Li Yunxin was prepared and immediately reached out to grab it. But because of this slight pause, the distance between him and Qing Kongzi narrowed considerably. As soon as he held the cold, stiff corpse in his hand he knew. Although he had returned to his original form after death, there was still some demonic power left in his body. If it wasn't the demonic power cultivated by his water cloud force, what else could it be? Qing Kongzi saw Li Yunxin's countenance turned greenish-gray in a split second. He laughed aloud in delight. Do you understand now? You scoundrel, at this moment you only know how to run away in panic. Those demon generals under your command were all killed by me. But one escaped. After I catch you, I'll catch that one too and sacrifice it to my 46 disciples. before he finished speaking, he suddenly heard a thunderous roar exploding in front of him. "You're courting death." This voice was like thunder, really like thunder. The roiling wave of air pressed down with a bang, and it instantly blew Xianxia to the point his figure froze and was almost blasted flying back. At that moment he was greatly alarmed. He thought that Li Yunxin was going to take the opportunity to escape again, but he didn't expect. The next moment, the fiendish demon opened its bloody mouth full of sharp fangs, turned around and charged straight at him. He had already mustered all his strength to chase after it. Who would have thought that Li Yunxin really had the guts to come back? There was a distance of a few hundred feet between the two, but with their speed, the few hundred feet was nothing more than the distance between their hands and feet. With a loud bang, Li Yunxin's ferocious demonic body that was surrounded by clouds and mist and golden blood crashed right into Xianxia. In just a split second there was a burst of lightning. That purple, blue, white. It was already unclear whether it was the dragons of the Nine Heavens thunderfire that Li Yunxin unleashed, or the Nine Heavens godly thunder that was unleashed by Xianxia's protective magic treasure. The intertwined lightning was like an exploding fire pill. In just a breath's time, it had swept across the heaven and earth within a radius of dozens of miles. The dense forest on the ground, the towering ancient trees, everything was turned into black charcoal in an instant. Then they were shredded into the tiniest powder by the strong wind that came like a landslide and a tsunami. In the midst of this earth-shattering explosion, Long Sun's extremely violent roar could still be heard. "Are you playing electric shock with me? Huh." This collision only happened in a split second. The next moment, a bolt of lightning suddenly rushed out, and a figure appeared more than 100 feet away. But it was not the seriously injured Li Yunxin but Xianxia, the headmaster of the Nine Heavens godly thunder sect, who was laughing loudly just a moment ago, was now in tattered clothes, covered in blood, and even his left arm was missing. There was only a piece of stubble left on his shoulder, as if it had been torn off by a sharp claw. The expression on his face was already one of shock, panic, and fear. That Li Yunxin actually dared to come back, and that seriously injured body was still so strong. However, the next moment, a body that looked like it was cast from steel suddenly pounced straight down from the sky full of lightning. With one blow, it blasted Xianxia into the already charred forest below. There was another indescribable loud noise. The high-speed fall and the high temperature caused by the collision ignited the already charred and torn forest. A huge fireball rose from the ground and a huge amount of sand and stones were lifted into the sky like a huge wave. The rolling shock wave violently and brutally destroyed the dense forest within a radius of hundreds of miles. A terrible mushroom cloud that was hundreds of meters high soared into the sky. And in the center of this terrible explosion, in the distorted air and then burned out, Li Yunxin's demonic body was pressing Xianxia into a huge deep pit on the ground. Like a beast, he grabbed one of Xianxia's arms and brutally tore it off. "Do you like to chase?" His voice was out of tune. It no longer sounded like a human voice, but more like the violent roar of a beast. His face was extremely distorted in the fire, as if he was a terrible demon god that appeared from the 9 levels of hell. However, Xianxia's body was still at the level of a perfected master. Even though his snow mountain and chi ocean were pierced by the sharp angle of Li Yunxin's knee, his consciousness was still not extinguished, and his body was still strong. Therefore, when Li Yunxin tore his arm again, he actually had to slowly tear off the extremely tough muscles, bit by bit, before he could tear it off. Xianxia let out a terrible cry of pain. However, this cry of pain seemed to make the demon god's ferocious nature on his body even stronger. "Why don't you chase me again?" He opened his bloody mouth and let out an even more terrifying howl. Finally, he tore that right arm off as well. Xianxia had already lost his mind from the pain. In the high temperature and fire that quickly burned his face into countless blisters, he opened his mouth and cursed, "You demon, you have to..." Ah! Halfway through his words, it suddenly turned into a series of screams. This was because Li Yunxin suddenly leaned over and used his mouth full of fangs to tear his abdomen open. Before the blood of the perfected master had the time to spurt out, it had already been burnt to nothingness in the extreme heat of the explosion. But his 5 viscera and 6 bowels needed to hold on for a little longer, and so did his consciousness. he experienced the excruciating pain of having his organs torn apart by the demon god's fangs. Wah ya 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 ya. Qing Kongzi's whole body was trembling from the pain, his words turned into a series of strange cries. But the voice stopped abruptly. Just as he opened his mouth to beg for mercy, Li Yunxin suddenly raised his head and bit off his head. With a puff, he spat it out like a peach pit. Without the screams of the true state Taoist, the whole world seemed to be quiet in an instant. Only the whirring flames and the buzzing sound of the air could be heard. In the soaring flames, Li Yunxin slowly stood up on Qing Kongzi's corpse. That corpse had been completely torn apart by him and turned into a pile of minced meat. And the huge and terrible wound on his back was shrinking at a speed visible to the naked eye in the burning flames. His shoulders slightly collapsed, he looked up at the sky and unconsciously grinned. Minced meat and golden blood flowed down from the corner of his mouth, as if a brutal prehistoric beast had just finished eating and was looking for the next target. At this moment, high up in the sky, far away, there were indeed two true state Taoists, Mingzhenzi and Gui Yuanzi. They arrived here 3 breaths ago, and witnessed the scene of Li Yunxin tearing Qing Kongzi alive. And now, these two perfected spiritual masters stopped in the sky in a daze, looking at the figure of Li Yunxin in the raging flames on the ground. They only felt a terrible chill rising from their tailbones, climbing all the way to the Baihui point on the top of their heads. Although they were separated by a distance of thousands of meters, although Li Yunxin still looked like a small black shop in the center of the huge sea of fire from the sky. But that terrible momentum that was like a landslide and a tsunami still made the two of them feel difficult to breathe, as if their bodies were slightly trembling. Just like that, the terrible fierce beast and the two human cultivators looked at each other from a distance for 10 breaths of time. Then, Li Yunxin suddenly roared with a violent and hoarse voice, "Come, chase." The two figures in the sky swayed slightly. After 2 breaths of time, the two perfected spiritual masters immediately turned into 2 streams of light, whizzing away. After a full 4 hours, the fire in the sea of fire was extinguished. However, an even fiercer fire had already spread in all directions. The sky was covered by the rolling thick smoke. As far as the eye could see, there was endless light and flames in all directions. Li Yunxin let out a low groan and his tall demonic body fell to the ground with a bang. Chapter 341. Gui Yuanzi and Ming Zhenzi ran for more than 400 miles before they dared to stop. In fact, the two perfected masters had never let their guard down against Li Yunxin. They were the ones who started the thunderbolt attack on Li Yunxin with the combined forces of the 3 sections. But the problem was that they didn't expect him to be so fierce. In the past, Li Yunxin used schemes, but they were just schemes after all. They were afraid of Li Yunxin's schemes and the traps he might set up, so they tried to solve the problem using the most direct method, pure violence. Only now did they realize one thing: he was a dragon son in the real state. When it came to violence, his violence was as frightening as his brain. Other people's brains were usually covered by their fierce martial strength, but this guy used his brain to make people ignore his martial strength. The scene before Qing Kongzi died still made these two perfected spiritual masters feel a chill down their spines. In fact, they weren't particularly afraid of death, but Qing Kongzi, a perfected spiritual master, the head of the 9 Heavens Godly Thunder sect, was actually torn apart by the ferocious beast-like Li Yunxin with his fangs and claws. His godly demon body was as tall as 2 or 3 times the size of a normal person. Qing Kongzi was like a hare or a lamb under his body. When the two of them bumped into each other, the 9th heaven thunderous fire of the dragon clan pierced through his snow mountain and ocean of qi. Demons were the best at close combat. Qing Kongzi was bewitched and actually chased after him. The 2 sect masters thought about this carefully, and then thought about how he would die without any honor. Who would be willing to die like that? Demons. Demons are demons after all. Once their ferocious nature was triggered, they couldn't be judged by common sense. They actually used such a reckless fighting method. Hiya. Gui Yunzi calmed down, turned his head to look to the east and said in a low voice, "Don't be in the sky. Go down, go down." Ming Zhenzi didn't say anything to refute and followed his advice. Below them was also a vast wilderness, the trees blocking out the sky and the sun. In such an environment, the 2 sect leaders felt safer. They had to meditate for a while, think for a while, and come up with a plan for the next step. After all, that Li Yunxin, is so ferocious. Ming Zhenzi muttered to himself and sighed in a low voice. Duanfang, we previously said that he would escape from our territory. Now do you think will he escape or still came back for us? He didn't say this out loud. Because once he said it, even he himself would feel ashamed of his own cowardice. However, the Lingshu sword sect and the Xianxia pill cauldron sect were on the border of the Qin kingdom. One was on the border between the Qin kingdom and the Yi kingdom. To cultivators and great fiendish demons, it was actually not considered far. He is already heavily injured, right? Gui Yuanzi frowned and thought for a while before he said, I think he went berserk just now and fought with his life on the line. If he really had any energy left, he would have killed his way to the heavens just now. Now that he thought about it again, perhaps he only looked fierce but was actually extremely weak. I'm thinking, should we go back again? That headmaster Qing Kongzi, before he died, he probably thought the same. His words were cut off by someone else. It was none other than Lu Gongzan. Earlier, Ming Zhenzi had also brought Lu Gongzan into the sky. However, Lu Gongzan was in the emptiness realm, and his body was not as strong as a real person's. If he was exposed to the strong winds in the sky, he would probably be blown apart after traveling for a quarter of an hour. Thus, Ming Zhenzi had used the heaven and earth sleeve technique to trap him in his sleeve. Now that he was placed on the ground, this Lu Laodao seemed to have become the calmest person. Not only did he have the courage to interrupt Gui Yuanzi, but he also had the courage to swagger a few steps away. He found a lying, withered tree trunk in the shady green grass and sat down. He breathed as if no one else was around. It seemed that the fact that his old master Li Yunxin had torn Qing Kongzi apart alive made him a lot stronger. He was no longer in a sorry state like before. Gui Yuanzi suddenly turned his head and glared at him. The black hair behind his head spread out, making him look like an angry lion. When facing this Lao Dao, his nervousness and worry were all gone. His imposing manner flourished again. Good, you evil Taoist. Are you getting arrogant again? Aren't you afraid that we'll find your demon master and kill him? I think we can't let you live. Let's kill you here. After he finished speaking, he strode over and raised his hand, ready to strike at the top of Lu Gongzan's head. However, Lu Laodao was not in a hurry. He didn't even dodge. He stared at Gui Yuanzi and a mocking smile appeared on his face. Sect leader, forget it. It's already this time. Laodao, I didn't ask you guys to go because I was afraid that you guys would die of stupidity. You won't really kill me, so there's no need to embarrass everyone. Gui Yuanzi's palm wind had already pressed down on the top of Lu Gongzan's head. However, at this moment he was really stopped by Ming Zhenzi. Duanfang, I still have something to ask him. Thus, this sect leader of the Xianxia pill cauldron sect's face became extremely ugly. Naturally, he didn't really want to kill Lu Gongzan. Otherwise, just raising his hand would be enough. There was no need for him to walk like a dragon or a tiger. Ming Zhenzi gave him a way out of this embarrassing situation. His face turned red and he stared at Lu Gongzan for a few more times. Then he snorted and suddenly turned around. Lu Laodao smiled. Sect leader Ming Zhenzi, do you know where your problem is? Ming Zhenzi frowned and took a few deep breaths. He also slowly calmed his emotions. Then he narrowed his eyes and said, Problem? Tell me. If you hit the nail on the head, then I wouldn't have spared your life in vain. Old Taoist Lu shook his head slightly and sighed softly, to say something damned. Sect leaders, in front of that Li Yunxin, you guys are really like children. Gui Yuanzi wanted to glare again, but Ming Zhenzi raised his hand to stop him. Lao Dao then continued, I've seen Ling Kongzi before and I've also seen Yunzi. That fairy Ling Kong. When I first saw her, her aura was terrifying as if she was a celestial fairy. Looking at her, I only felt that she was unfathomable. Her words and actions were also confusing, and I only thought that it was the methods of celestials. But later now when I think about what that fairy Ling Kong did, I understand. The reason why she is unfathomable and unfathomable is because her thoughts are too pure. Pure like a child's. But she also has great power. This is power and wealth that people in the secular world revere. When a person has power and wealth, then no matter how stupid or simple they are, others will also guess that she definitely wouldn't do such a stupid thing. There must be a deep meaning behind it. But in reality, if one can see through it, then power is useless. Li Yunxin can see through this point. That's why Fairy Ling Kong was played in the palm of his hand, and only understood when she died. Lu Gongzan sighed again and looked left and right. Seeing a thin and long wild ginger, he stretched out his hand and plucked off the red and green stems and leaves, putting it in his mouth to chew. As for that Yinzi, Lao Dao, I also have to admit that his schemes surpass others. Unfortunately, he's still a bit lacking compared to Li Yunxin. He and the two of you, and even Ling Kongzi, all made a mistake. They felt that Li Yunxin is a teenager, and what kind of knowledge could he have? Unfortunately, that Li Yunxin is a natural devil. Although he's only a teenager, who knows where he got his experience? Anyone who treats him as a child or a teenager will die a horrible death. I know that the three Sendo don't think they're stupid. When Lu Laodao said this, he paused slightly and spat out the wild ginger in his mouth. He suddenly laughed. Hee. But for me, Laodao, among cultivators the three Sendo are probably not stupid. But among the secular people. Hearing this, Ming Jinzi's brows gradually relaxed. He calmly pondered for a while, then said, "Continue. This seat will pardon you." Lu Gongzan cupped his hands at him loosely, but his tone was resolute and decisive. But among the secular people, the three of you and even the cultivators of Daotong and Kenzhou can be regarded as stupid. Ming Jinzi's eyelids twitched and he turned his head to look at Gui Yuanzi. Gui Yuanzi's face was ashen, but he didn't say anything. He only snorted. Lu Gongzan continued as if there was no one else around. "This isn't your fault. In reality it's like this. Cultivators Sendo have profound Taoist arts and countless riches. There are many things that you've never cared about, but to us, the secular people, actually require a lot of brain power to do. For example, when I Lao Dao was poor, how much brain power did I use in order to seek food and clothing? I had to think about whether to go out and sell paintings the next day, in the day or at night. Should I go to the south of the city or the north of the city? The Lin family of the south of the city lost their youngest son, and they were holding a funeral. That Lin family's master was a stingy person. If I went to his place, would he kick me out because he was in a bad mood, or would he show some mercy because of the pain of losing his son, and instead buy all of my paintings to guard his house? I sell a pot of wine and think about how much money I have in my pocket. Can I borrow a few large sums of money from that Munenju? After borrowing that large sum of money, and seeing that it's almost the end of the year, can I say a few small words, and take advantage of that shopkeeper's good mood to use a painting to guard his house to make up for it? Because of all these, we poor people in the secular world always have endless worries in our hearts. Every step we take, trouble follows us. Those rich people also laugh at us, saying that we only know how to scheme for these things every day, that we're not magnanimous and that we can't do great things. But those rich people and even the Sendo find it very difficult to understand that people like us, just to survive, we have exhausted our blood and sweat. If we're magnanimous, if we don't scheme, I'm afraid we won't even be able to survive. In the past, if we put our mind to this, we would indeed become shrewd people in the marketplace. For example, look at a woman, she is very eloquent, she is very sophisticated in the ways of the world. You change your countenance, you say something, she will be able to understand what you are thinking in your heart. But if you ask that woman to do big business, to study, to cultivate, she will become extremely stupid. The people of the world call this petty cleverness. I think all of you Sendo will also look down on this petty cleverness, because your power is too strong. Lu Laodao raised his head with deep emotion and pointed his finger to the sky. Mortals think that you are in the sky. What you want is as easy as blowing off dust. Mortals need to calculate, they need to think, but you only need to speak and there will be mortals to worship you. As the saying goes, one strong person can defeat 10 skilled people. Your power can disregard any schemes of the mortals. But now, there is such an anomaly like Li Yunxin. His petty cleverness can be considered top-notch among the mortals. But he still possesses the same formidable power as all of you Sendo. With these two combined, two Sendo in front of him, are you considered stupid? Perhaps that Li Yunxin, after another 100 years, 1,000 years, will gradually become like all of you because using power is far more convenient than using schemes. But it definitely won't be now. How did that sect master Qing Kongzi die? Speaking of it, it's too simple. Li Yunxin still had some strength left, but he didn't want to be entangled with him. Because if he was delayed by him, you too might catch up to him. 1 against 3, his chances of victory aren't great. But that Qing Kongzi actually tried to provoke him. You must know that Li Yunxin is a demon. If this demon was really so weak that he couldn't escape, would he allow himself to be chased to death? He should have turned back long ago and fought to the death. This logic, any slightly astute mortals would understand. But Sect Master Qing Kongzi didn't want to think too much. Because normally he doesn't need to think too much. So Li Yunxin turned back and killed him in an instant. What about you two? At that time, if he had immediately pounced down, he might have been able to kill Li Yunxin. Lao Dao, I'm guessing that Li Yunxin was really bluffing at that time. But the two of you actually turned around and left. If you left, then so be it. Why are you planning to go back now? Could it be that you've forgotten how that Qing Kongzi died? Lu Lao Dao stretched out his hand and pointed to the east. Tu Sendo, do you believe it? At this moment that Li Yunxin didn't even run away, but stayed where he was and accumulated his energy. As long as the Tu Sendo go back, he has already obtained this breathing time and has already made preparations. The two of you will definitely end up like that Qing Kongzi. Having said this, he threw away the already warm wild ginger in his hand and stood up. And I stopped the Tu Sendo not to fight for a chance to live. But I've already pledged my allegiance to the Sendo. That rat spirit and rabbit spirit died because of me. Will Li Yunxin still let me go? Even now, the two Sendos still don't believe me, aren't you stupid? At this time, Gui Yuanzi and Ming Zhenzi seemed to be really dumbfounded. Perhaps they were like what Lu Laodao said, stupid. But it wasn't that they didn't care about life and death, success or failure. Lu Gongzhan's words were unpleasant to hear. But these unpleasant words were like a sharp, snow-white blade, each blade drawing blood. After a long period of silence, Ming Zhenzi let out a light sigh and raised his eyes to look at him. I won't pursue what you said for the time being. But there's one thing. When Qing Kongzi threw out those two corpses, Li Yunxin became violent. Does he really care about the demon generals under his command that much? Can he use this to lure him into a trap? For example, you? Lu Laodao chuckled twice and shook his head. Sendo's thinking is off again. In this world, if there's anyone who understands Li Yunxin the most, it's me. Sendo said that Li Yunxin suddenly became violent because he saw the corpses of the demon generals under his command. He actually hoped that Sendo thought this way. But in reality, it's not like that. Ming Zhenzi seriously thought for a while. Then it's to confuse us and create this illusion? Lu Gongzhan was silent for a while and sighed. That's not it. Li Yunxin's violent rise was real, and his resentment was also real. But it wasn't because of the demon generals themselves, but because of himself. He didn't cherish the lives of demon generals that much. What truly made him angry was the feeling of not being able to control the life and death of the demon generals under his command. These two things seem similar, but there's a world of difference between them. That Li Yunxin only cares about himself. Even if he seems to care about others, it's still for himself. Ming Zhenzi seriously thought for a while again and sighed in understanding. What you said is somewhat reasonable. This person. He turned his head to look at Gui Yuanzi. Gui Yuanzi was also silent for a while. But you have to be careful. This Taoist isn't an ordinary person. In the world, perhaps there were only a handful of cultivators who could receive the evaluation of the Pill Cauldron sect's sect master. And among the people of the secular world, this Lu Gongzhan was definitely not rare. But in this kind of situation, this kind of evaluation wasn't a good thing. At the same time this signified approval, it also signified fear, vigilance, and a lingering hidden worry related to life and death. Ming Zhenzi turned his head to look at Lu Gongzhan again. Good. You, this Taoist, also have the root of wisdom and immortal fate. Although your background isn't clean, I'll temporarily take it that you were previously coerced by that demon Li Yunxin. But from today onwards you must follow by my side. If I discover that you still have any shameful dealings with demons, I'll immediately take your life. Lu Gongzhan took a deep breath, restraining his expression. Then he raised his hand and gave a deep Taoist salute, saying solemnly, the two Sendo have a broad bearing and don't stick to one pattern. You're actually able to take Lao Dao's words to heart. That's something that demon Li Yunxin can't do. Being able to follow by Sendo's side, how would I dare to have any improper thoughts? Lao Dao, my only wish is to be able to learn the profound Dao for the rest of my life, stay away from the disputes of the secular world, and live a peaceful and unfettered life. Ming Zhenzi faintly smiled. Did you have a Taoist name in the past? My teacher in the secular world once bestowed the Taoist name, Primordius. Ming Xinzi thought for a moment. My high heaven sword sect's seniority. Oh, your Taoist name is also suitable. A teacher in the secular world is still a teacher, so leave your Taoist name. It's just that my sword sect doesn't have a suitable method for you to cultivate. But right now you're still a sinner. Only by eliminating that demon Li Yunqing can you clear your name. At that time you'll naturally have a way to cultivate. But now, since you said that you understand Li Yunqing the best, what do you think we should do? Lu Gongzan shook his head and smiled bitterly. Sendo, my knowledge is limited and I don't know what the current situation of Daotong and Kenzo is like. It's like a general leading a new army. The soldiers don't know the general and the general doesn't know the soldiers. How can I think of a brilliant method? But really, there's only one method, using force to break through ingenuity. When dealing with Li Yunqing, you absolutely can't compete with him in wits. If you can gather the strength of Daotong and Kenzo to work together to hunt him down, and not let him have a moment of peace, you can probably eliminate him as soon as possible. Ming Xinzi really took his words to heart. He pondered for a moment and sighed slightly. It's not easy. That Qin Kongzi hasn't had any disciples fall in his hands before, and he himself has never seen Li Yunqing. Thus he underestimated the enemy. He's not the only one who thinks like that. And now Daotong and Kenzo. At this point Gui Yuanzi coughed softly. Thus Ming Xinzi also stopped talking. Let's leave this place first. Since the situation is like this. We have to avenge our disciples. Let's spread the news that Li Yunqing escaped with serious injuries to the world. Let's see how long he can hold on. Finished speaking, he waved his big sleeve. The three of them stuck close to the wild forest and headed west. Behind them, the dark clouds in the sky became thicker and thicker. The fire in the wild forest also became bigger and bigger. It was already autumn. Although the forest still looked dark green, the branches and leaves of the trees were no longer as plump and full as in summer. The terrifyingly high temperature first roasted the branches and leaves near the fire line dry of water, and then more fuel fueled the fire, causing it to spread even faster. Because of the high temperature, the air waves that rose into the sky swept away a large amount of dust, which then gathered into thick clouds high up in the sky. Thus there were white ashes and shards falling down. It was as if winter had come early and snow had fallen from the sky. This vast and boundless wild forest took up almost a tenth of the area of the Daqing state. It had grown for hundreds of thousands of years. How many billions of creatures lived in it? Now these creatures had either died in the fire that filled the sky, were still fleeing in fear, or were completely unaware of the red god of death approaching in the distance. The source of the fire that spread from the center of the primeval forest was not ordinary fire. This forest was also boundless. It would be difficult for the mortal government, villages, and towns to immediately know that such a disaster had occurred. Thus the fire grew larger and stronger. After 10 days, it had become a great calamity that the Qin kingdom had not seen in 100,000 years. This fire that filled the sky first burned to the small border town in the north of the Qin kingdom, Changji. To the north of the Qin kingdom was the Yi kingdom. There was a natural geographical dividing line between the Qin kingdom and the Yi kingdom, the Tulan River. The town of Changji sat on the south bank of the Tulan River, separated from the north bank by less than 10 meters. This was also the width of the middle reaches of the Tulan River. In this world this could not be considered a large river. The people of Changji relied on the wild forest to make a living. About 80 to 90% of the people in the town engaged in the logging industry. They cut down towering ancient trees from the wild forest and dragged them to the riverside to weave them into wooden rafts, using the relentless river water to transport the logs downstream. Now that it was autumn, it was already the end of September. In Changji town, this meant that there was still a little more than a month before the first snow fell. Then the Tulan River would freeze and they could rest for the winter. Before that, they could make another trip into the depths of the wild forest. Changji town had existed for 100 years. Although it would be replanted after it was cut down, gradually, there was no longer any decent wood nearby. This decent referred to the thickness of 5 people holding hands around it. The rich families in the north called the wood of these trees 5 treasures. Only this was a high-grade item that could be sold for a price. The men heading into the forest had set off 8 days ago. Logically speaking, it would take at least half a month for the first batch of wood to be shipped out. However, this year, in the 11th year of the Zhongyuan of the Qing calendar, the men of Changji town had for the first time returned early. And so, these panicked men also brought a terrible news. Chapter 342. The monstrous flames formed a wall of fire. Looking up, there were dark clouds and the blue sky could not be seen. Looking to the left and right, it extended beyond the horizon without an end. The terrible heat wave roasted the towering trees from dozens of meters away. Cold water splashed on them, even from dozens of meters away, would turn into extremely hot, transparent, superheated steam. In an instant it could scorch human flesh and pieces of flesh would fall from the skeleton. This terrible flame was pressing into Changji town. And judging from the speed of its advance, it would arrive within 5 days. It was impossible for human power to resist such a natural disaster. According to the experience passed down from generation to generation in this town, even the Toulon River could not stop the fire at this time. If they wanted to survive, there were only 2 choices. The first was to move the town. Changji town was surrounded by wild forests and in fact the town was almost wrapped in the forest. But now it was already autumn and winter was coming. What could they take with them and where could they go in 5 days? The state capital in the north was not rich, and in winter, a large number of refugees would gather in the big cities to survive the few months. But even in a good year, dozens of unclaimed corpses would be found outside the big cities every spring, not to mention this year was not a good year. They left their homeland and had no place to go. This cold winter would become unusually cruel, they might all die. Then, there was only the second choice. Around Changji town an empty space was quickly cut down. When the monstrous flame reached here, it might pass through the town. But this would mean a terrible workload, surrounding the town with a radius of dozens of meters, cutting down hundreds and thousands of trees that were about to mature. This was an unprecedented harsh challenge. But for the sake of their homeland to have a place to temporarily survive the coming winter, the people of Changji town chose the latter. They wanted to challenge this natural disaster, caused by some terrible power that they could not understand. So on the first day they began to cut down the small trees around the town. These small trees, including the small trees that could only be hugged by a person, were cut down, dragged into the town, used to strengthen houses or made into various tools. The population of this town was not large, only about 100. However, among these hundreds of people, even the wealthiest Yu family who dominated the town's timber purchasing power, were experts in this kind of work. On the same day, the news of Li Yunxin tearing apart Chengkongzi and being heavily injured spread to the southwest and northwest, including the Qing, Yi, Yu, Qin, Ping, Qi and Shi countries. The dozens of sects of Daotong and Kenzo all had sects in these countries and spread the news even more widely. However, the whereabouts of Li Yunxin was still a mystery. They had sent out disciples but no one had seen the demon. This seemed to be a matter of common sense. The territories of these countries were so vast, but the number of cultivators was pitifully small compared to the number of cultivators. Even though there were garrisons in all the major cities, they could only cast a general net, and that net was too big. By the next day the small trees around Changji town had all been cut down, and people began to deal with the bigger, thicker trees. The entire town was mobilized. The young and strong laborers worked day and night, while the old, weak women and children were responsible for food and sundries. The town had never been so united and busy before, but the fear that accompanied the busyness also lingered. But there were always strange people in the town, a young man and 2 even younger women. The 3 of them came to Changji a few days ago and stayed with the Yu family. It was said that they were also surnamed Yu. However, the man's surname was Yu and the 2 women didn't have surnames, only given names. One was called Wu Su and the other was Li Li. The 3 of them became the only idlers in the town. But in fact the man was the most idle and the 2 women were still busier. For example, the man surnamed Yu, named Yu Meng, moved a chair at noon and sat in front of the Yu family's door, watching the people of the town bustle back and forth. On the road paved with bluestone slabs, the men were shouting and carrying logs with faces full of impatience as they walked towards the lumber yard in the north of the town. Their clothes were torn by grass and wood, and their faces were covered with dust, mud and sweat. Their hair was disheveled and there were even blisters at the corners of their mouths. But inside the bluestone brick gate of the Yu family's town, Yu Meng sat steadily on a rattan chair. He held a pot of tea in his right hand and played with a small black sword in his left. Two girls, one massaged his legs and the other peeled peanuts and put them in his mouth. They looked disgustingly leisurely. There weren't many girls in this small town that mainly relied on manual labor. Even if there were, they had long lost their original delicate and cute looks because of the hardships of the years. The 13 or 14-year-old girls had dark skin and stout bodies, like the rough women in the city of Wei. Therefore Wuxia and Lili made the eyes of the people in the town light up. They were beautiful and had snow-white skin. Although their small hands weren't soft and boneless, they weren't as rough and calloused as those big hands. Most importantly, they had a different temperament that the people in the town had never seen before. They were dignified, elegant, and naturally had an indescribable sense of nobility when dealing with people. But they didn't have the snobbish attitude of the rich families in the nearby counties. On one hand, they made people feel that they couldn't be played with and difficult to get close to, but on the other hand they made people feel extremely kind. At least that was what Xiaoping thought. Sun Xiaoping was carrying a log as thick as a bowl, and walking towards the north of the town. He was sandwiched between two people and could only see the inside of the Yu family's house through the gaps between the logs. But at least he could see it openly. If he walked outside, he would probably be like the other teenagers, looking straight ahead, and only glancing at them when they were wiping their sweat or coughing too frequently. But even this time was too short. They quickly walked past the Yu family's house. Sun Xiaoping walked a few more steps and felt his shoulders getting hot and itchy from the rough bark. So he suddenly spat on the ground. That Yu Meng is a lazy glutton. He doesn't even move his own hands and only orders people around. Those two girls have a hard life. Talking about these things at this time, no one should have paid attention to him. Unexpectedly, he received a warm and widespread response. The originally heavy and anxious atmosphere relaxed a little, as if the topic about the two girls had temporarily relieved these men. Then they started to talk about it. But they weren't helping. Some people who had been to the manors and prefectures laughed, saying that Yu Meng looked like the son of a rich family. This was not the kind of rich family in the county, but at least a rich young master in the prefectures. The maids of such a rich person probably ate and dressed much better than the master Yu in the town. In the future, when the young master married his wife, these two maids who had served him since they were young would probably become his concubines. From then on, as long as the family didn't decline, they would live a luxurious life. If this was called a hard life, then what were they called? Poor lives. Xiaoping understood in his heart, but he was not convinced and grumbled a few more words. So the married man laughed. First of all, for the maids of such a rich family, those things were their duty. If young master Yu did it himself, they would be so panicked that they would cry. Two weak girls, one could tell from their hands that they were spoiled. If young master Yu didn't need them to do anything, what would they do? Would they be chased out? After saying this, he teased Xiaoping, asking if he had feelings for the two maids. The one called Wuxia looked like the older sister with a pair of almond-shaped eyes. She looked very dignified and probably did things in a steady manner. The one called Lily looked like the younger sister with a pair of almond-shaped eyes, and when she didn't smile she had a bit of charm. It's just that these two beauties probably don't like you, Xiaoping, so don't even think about it. After they finished talking, a burst of good-natured laughter suddenly burst out. This laughter passed through the streets and alleys, and seemed to lighten the dark clouds in the distant sky. But after a while, the laughter suddenly stopped and everyone became silent. Because it was snowing. White powder floated down from the sky as if the winter snow had arrived early. People knew that this meant the fire was getting closer and closer. If they didn't manage to escape this calamity, then those two lovely girls would also be buried. That fire didn't discriminate between life and death. Its ashes. Yu Meng put the small sword on his leg, raised his hand to catch the ashes and looked at it. There are only 3 or 4 days left. His tone and expression now were completely different from the silly young master Yu in the city of Wei. Even because of these days of running around, his skin was darker and his figure thinner. It made his eyes look even bigger. Wuxia stopped and raised her hand. Do we really have to stay here? I went to see the fire a few days ago. Young master, it didn't look like an ordinary fire. It seemed to be made by a Taoist. Could it be that they are looking for you? Yu Meng laughed. They don't need to make such a big fuss to find me. It's more like dealing with Li Yunxin. But there's no news from him recently. People don't dare to go to Dongting anymore. After a while, Lily suddenly said, "These people are really stupid. Why do they want to cut down all the trees?" I heard third uncle said that at this time, a fire from the inside would be enough. Yu Meng laughed again. It depends on the time. They will definitely use this method, but not now. They have to cut down all the big and small trees and carry them away and then set fire to the bushes. Otherwise the woods are so dense. It will be bad if the fire doesn't burn out and the fire from the other side comes again. Besides, once the fire is over, there will be nothing left. As for food, we can barely eat the food we have. But what do we use to keep warm in winter? It's so cold that the roots of the trees under the ground are all frozen. If the snow collapses the house, or we have to sell some wood in the spring next year. So, they are not only trying to prevent fire. This Master Yu is doing a good job. If in the past he could be one of our... He had unintentionally said this and stopped, not saying anything more. After a while he closed his eyes and leaned back on the cane chair, sighing softly, "Let's wait for Mr. Liu." Wu Su and Lily didn't say anything. They just went to do their work in silence and heartache. They have been here for half a month. Her young master didn't say why he came here. He only said he was waiting for someone. His former teacher, one of the most famous masters in the martial arts world, water-repelling sword Lu Gongjiao. So the next day passed, but the Taoist priests of various schools in various countries still didn't find any trace of Li Yunxin. At this time, the mortals in the secular world discovered the terrible fire. The competent provincial government began to organize the villagers to put out the fire, but soon realized that the fire was not ordinary fire. During the fight between Li Yunxin and Qing Kongzi, one released the ninth heaven thunderfire and the other released the ninth heaven godly thunder. How could mortals put out the fire caused by these two forces that didn't belong to the secular world? So the disaster couldn't be hidden anymore. It was reported to the higher authorities and reached the higher authorities. At this level, the Taoist priests stationed in the major cities had to be alerted. The wilderness forest almost supported half of the surrounding population. Even the stupidest of officials knew that if this dense forest was burned down, the consequences would be terrible. So the Taoist priests began to cast spells to try to put out the fire. But soon they realized it wasn't as easy as they thought. The fire was ignited by a true state Long Sun and a true state Taoist priest who specialized in thunder and fire. They fought with all their strength and risked their lives. How could the disciples in the conception and emptiness realms easily put out such a fire? So 3 days later, after the disciples who were sent out to try to find Li Yunxin's traces had tried, the Taoist priests of higher levels had no choice but to participate in this fire-extinguishing operation. As a result, the shortage of manpower increased, and Li Yunxin's whereabouts became even more mysterious. So on the 5th day, on the 5th night, the sky of Changji town was still not dark. Instead, it turned into a terrifying and heart-palpitating blood red. The waves of fire could already be seen. The waves of fire covered the sky and the sun, like a 100-meter-high wall. The waves of fire not only brought high temperature but also strong wind. The strong airflow rolled up to the sky, and the streets and houses of Changji town could hear the howling of ghosts. The terrifying hot wind blew everything away. Even the surface of the Toulon River was covered with white mist, as if the whole town was sucked into another space. A day ago they set fire to the bushes outside the town. Now there was a 10-meter-wide isolation zone between the town and the wilderness forest. People gathered on the streets and breathed in the hot and suffocating air. They held all kinds of containers filled with water in their hands and waited in fear for the judgment of the fire. At around 7 p.m., 19 p.m. to 21 p.m., the forest outside the isolation zone was finally ignited. The waves of fire rose outside the town. At this time, even if people looked up, they couldn't see the top of the waves of fire. It seemed as if it was burning all the way to the sky and would collapse in the next moment. The town was surrounded by the flaming mountain, and it faced the Toulon River, which was even more foggy. When the trees were burning, the crackling sound was even louder than the firecrackers during the New Year. But the whistling sound of the airflow was even louder than the crackling sound. The young children were frightened and cried, but their cries were very weak in such a sound, just an inconspicuous interlude. The burning lasted for half an hour. The water in the buckets and basins of the people in the town began to warm up. But the people's efforts in the past 5 days seemed to have paid off. The fire did not cross the isolation zone. The scorched earth they burned had undug tree roots, which began to smoke because of the extreme heat. So in the land outside the town, there seemed to be hundreds of smokers underground smoking pots. Fortunately, it was only emitting green smoke. After an hour, it did not catch on fire. This scene was strange and terrible, but people slowly relaxed. They felt that this disaster was probably going to be over. So another 2 hours passed. No one dared to close their eyes and sleep. They were all vigilant. Most of the houses in the town were made of wood. If there was a fire, all their efforts would be in vain. People began to talk in low voices while watching the night. It seemed that if they spoke too loudly, the evil spirits hidden in the fire would be alarmed and misfortune would come. They drank water, ate food, and vigilantly watched everything around them, watching the terrible fire not far away. But on the whole, their tense emotions were slowly relaxing. The next thing to think about was how to survive this cold winter. How to find a way out in the coming spring. Maybe they could switch to farming. After the fire of the wild forest, the land would be very fertile. Maybe they could hire a few farmers from the nearby state capital, and they could switch from forest farming to farming. But they did not know who owned the wild forest. They had lived in the forest for so many years, but except for the government's taxes, no one claimed ownership. But they heard from the old people in the town that the forest in Xianxia town, including the even wider forest, was indeed someone's private property. Just like that, another 4 hours passed. People began to feel tired and some people were drowsy. But at this time someone frowned. Sun Xiaoping and a few young people were guarding outside the town. At first they stood with water, gritted their teeth and endured the scorching heat, ready to put out the fire at any time. After 6 hours they also felt tired, so they put down the water buckets and sat down. They ate the dry food they brought and occasionally chatted to pass the time. Sun Xiaoping was concerned about the fire, and he was also concerned about the girls in the Yu family's residence in town. He didn't know why he couldn't eat or sleep these days. There was always an inexplicable restlessness in his heart, but he really didn't know how to get rid of it. Therefore that night he stared at a tree dozens of meters away, right next to the isolation zone, in a daze. He was lost in thought. For example, when was that girl going to leave? His third uncle said that young Master Yu would take them as concubines, but what about now? At night he felt that he was much better than young Master Yu. He didn't know how to order people around. If he married Miss Wuxia or Miss Lily, he wouldn't even let them touch the spring water. He used to study in the county school for 3 years, so he was literate, so it wouldn't be a disgrace to them. At that time his family was still well off. He stared at the tree and thought about all kinds of things. Then he suddenly straightened up, frowned, and let out a soft sound of surprise. No one heard his sigh. But then Sun Xiaoping stood up and walked a few steps forward. He craned his neck to look at the tree he stared at for a long time. Something wasn't right. You're tuning in to the Zhou Xian's Legacy YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.